Dove Books on Tape presents The Little Sister by Raymond Chandler. The pebbled glass door panel is lettered in flaked black paint. Philip Marlowe Investigations. It's a reasonably shabby door at the end of a reasonably shabby corridor in the sort of building that was new about the year the all-tile bathroom became the basis of civilization. Come on in. There's nobody here but me and a big blue bottle fly. I'd been stalking the blue bottle fly for 5 minutes. He didn't want to sit down. He just wanted to do wing-overs and sing the prologue to Pagliacci. There was a patch of bright sunlight on the corner of the desk, and I knew that sooner or later that was where he was going to light. The buzzing stopped, and there he was. And then the phone rang. I reached for it inch by inch with a slow and patient left hand. I lifted the phone slowly and spoke into it softly. "Hold the line a moment, please." I laid the phone down gently on the brown blotter. He was still there, shining and blue-green and full of sin. I took a deep breath and swung. What was left of him sailed halfway across the room and dropped to the carpet. I went over and picked him up by his good wing and dropped him into the wastebasket. "Thanks for waiting," I said into the phone. "Is this Mr. Marlowe, the detective?" It was a small, rather hurried, little girlish voice. I said it was Mr. Marlowe, the detective. "How much do you charge for your services, Mr. Marlowe?" "What was it you wanted done?" The voice sharpened a little. "I can't very well tell you over the phone. It's very confidential. Before I'd waste time coming to your office, I'd have to have some idea." $40 a day plus expenses, unless it's the kind of job that can be done for a flat fee." "That's far too much," the little voice said. "Why, it might cost hundreds of dollars, and I only get a small salary, and—" "Where are you now?" "Why, I'm in a drugstore. It's right next to the building where your office is." "You could have saved a nickel. The elevator's free." The small voice said very firmly, "This is a very delicate matter, very personal. I couldn't talk to just anybody." "If it's that delicate," I said, "maybe you need a lady detective." "Goodness, I didn't know there were any." Pause. "But I don't think a lady detective would do at all. You see, Orrin was living in a very tough neighborhood, Mr. Marlowe. The manager of the rooming house is a most unpleasant person. He smelled of liquor." "Do you drink, Mr. Marlowe?" "Well, now that you mention it." "I don't think I'd care to employ a detective that uses liquor in any form. I don't even approve of tobacco." "Would it be all right if I peeled an orange?" I said. Then I hung up. It was a step in the right direction, but it didn't go far enough. I ought to have locked the door and hid under the desk. 5 minutes later, the buzzer sounded. I got my feet off the desk, stood up, and looked out. Nobody ever looked less like Lady Macbeth. She was a small, neat, rather prissy-looking girl with primly smooth brown hair and rimless glasses. From a strap over her shoulder hung one of those awkward-looking square bags that make you think of a Sister of Mercy taking first aid to the wounded. On the smooth brown hair was a hat that had been taken from its mother too young. She had no makeup, no lipstick, no jewelry. The rimless glasses gave her that librarian look. I said, "Come on in." Then I held the chair for her. She sat down on about 2 inches of the edge. "That's no way to talk to someone on the phone. If I talked like that to one of Dr. Zugsmith's patients," she said, "I'd lose my position." "How is the old boy? I haven't seen him since that time I fell off the garage roof." She looked surprised and quite serious. "Why, surely you can't know Dr. Zugsmith. Dr. Alfred Zugsmith in Manhattan? Manhattan, Kansas, you know, not Manhattan, New York." "Must be a different Dr. Zugsmith," I said. "And your name?" "I'm not sure I'd care to tell you." Just window shopping, huh?" "I suppose you could call it that. If I have to tell my family affairs to a total stranger, I at least have the right to decide whether he's the kind of person I could trust." "Anybody ever tell you you're a cute little trick?" The eyes behind the rimless cheaters flashed. "I should hope not." I reached for a pipe and started to fill it. "Hope isn't exactly the word," I said. "Get rid of that hat." And get yourself a pair of those slinky glasses with colored rims. You know, the ones that are all cockeyed and oriental. Dr. Zugsmith wouldn't permit anything like that, she said quickly. Then, you really think so? She asked and blushed ever so slightly. I said, so you need help. What's your name and trouble? You talk too much. Yeah, I said, I talk too much. Lonely men always talk too much. Either that or they don't talk at all. Shall we get down to business? You don't look like the type that goes to see private detectives, and especially private detectives you don't know. I know that, she said quietly, and Orrin would be absolutely livid. Mother would be furious, too. I just picked your name out of the phone book. What's your name? I almost snarled. Orpha May Quest. She crinkled her eyes as if she could cry. I live with my mother, she went on, her voice getting rapid now as if my time was costing her. My father died 4 years ago. He was a doctor. My brother, Orrin, was going to be a surgeon too, but he changed into engineering after 2 years of medical. Then a year ago, Orrin came out to work for the Cal Western Aircraft Company in Bay City. It wasn't like Orrin not to write to us regularly. He only wrote twice to Mother and 3 times to me in the last 6 months. Mother and I got worried. So it was my vacation and I came out to see him. He'd never been away from Kansas before. She stopped. Aren't you going to take any notes? She asked. I grunted. She continued. I'd written to Orrin that I was coming, but I didn't get any answer, so all I could do was go down where he lived. It's an awful long way. I went in a bus. It's in Bay City, number 449 Idaho Street. She stopped again, then repeated the address, and I still didn't write it down. I know something has happened. It was just a cheap rooming house, and I didn't like the manager at all. A horrid kind of man. He said Orrin had moved away a couple of weeks before, and he didn't know where to, and he didn't care, and all he wanted was a good slug of gin. I don't know why Orrin would even live in a place like that. Did you say slug of gin? I asked. She blushed. That's what the manager said. I'm just telling you. All right, I said, go on. Well, I called the place where he worked. They said he'd been laid off like a lot of others. I began to get a little frightened. He might have had an accident or something. Did it occur to you to ask the police? Oh, no. Orrin would never forgive me. He's difficult enough at the best of times. Just what do you think might have happened? I asked. I guess if I knew that, I wouldn't have come to see you. How much would you charge to find him? I told you what my rates were. She clasped her hands on the edge of the desk and squeezed them together hard. She had about the most meaningless set of gestures I had ever laid eyes on. I thought, you being a detective and all, you could find him right away, she said. I couldn't possibly afford more than $20. I've got to buy my meals here and my hotel and the train going back, and you know the hotel is so terribly expensive, and the food on the train. Which one are you staying at? I'd rather not tell you, if you don't mind. Why? I'd rather not. I'm terribly afraid of Orrin's temper. Uh-huh. Just what is it you're scared of besides Orrin's temper, Miss Quest? I had let my pipe go out. I struck a match and held it to the bowl, watching her over it. Pipe smoking is a dirty habit. Mother never let Father smoke in the house, even the last 2 years after he had his stroke. He used to sit with that empty pipe in his mouth sometimes, but she didn't like him to do that, really. We owed a lot of money, too, and she said she couldn't afford to give him money for useless things like tobacco. The church needed it much more than he did. I'm beginning to get it, I said slowly. Take a family like yours, and somebody in it has to be the dark meat. She stood up sharply and clasped the first aid kit to her body. I don't like you, she said. I don't think I'm going to employ you. If you're insinuating that Orrin has done something wrong, well, I can assure you that it's not Orrin who's the black sheep of our family. I didn't move an eyelash. She suddenly began to cry. I reacted to that just the way a stuffed fish reacts to cut bait. Now I suppose you'll call the The police and the Manhattan paper will hear all about it, and they'll print something nasty about us." "You don't suppose anything of the sort. Stop chipping at my emotions. Let's see a photo of him." She dug something out of her bag, an envelope. Thin, but there could be a couple of snapshots in it. I didn't look inside. "Describe him the way you see him," I said. She concentrated. That gave her a chance to do something with her eyebrows. "He has light brown hair, and he brushes it straight back. He's very tall, over 6 feet, but he only weighs 140 pounds. He's sort of bony. He used to wear a little blonde mustache, but Mother made him cut it off. She said, 'Don't tell me. The minister needed it to stuff a cushion.'" "You can't talk like that about my mother," she yelped, getting pale with rage. "Oh, stop being silly. There's a lot of things about you I don't know. But you can stop pretending to be an Easter lily right now. Does Orrin have any distinguishing marks on him, like moles or scars, or a tattoo of the 23rd Psalm on his chest?" "He has a little scar on his left hand where he had a wart removed," she said tightly. "What about his habits? What does he do for fun, besides not smoking or drinking or going out with girls?" "Well, he studies a lot, and he has a very expensive camera, a Leica, I believe, that he likes to snap people with when they don't know. Sometimes it makes them mad, but Orrin says people ought to see themselves as they really are." I opened the envelope she'd given me and took out 2 prints, obviously not taken with a Leica or any other expensive camera. One of them was looking down and was no good to me. The other was a fairly good shot of a tall, angular bird with narrow-set eyes and a thin, straight mouth and a pointed chin. He had the expression I expected to see. If you forgot to wipe the mud off your shoes, he was the boy who would tell on you. "All right," I said. "I'll go down there and take a look. But you ought to be able to guess what's happened. This is not the kind of town, believe me it isn't. I know Bay City, that Manhattan, Kansas is. Orrin's the small-town, sanctimonious type of guy who's lived his entire life with his mother on his neck and the minister holding his hand. Out here, he's lonely. He's got dough, he'd like to buy a little sweetness and light, so he starts to play, and he doesn't know how to play. That takes experience, too. He's got himself all jammed up with some floozy and a bottle of hooch, and what he's done looks to him as if he'd stolen the bishop's pants. After all, the guy's going on 29 years old, and if he wants to roll in the gutter, that's his business. He'll find somebody to blame it on after a while." "I hate to believe you, Mr. Marlowe," she said slowly. "Something was said about $20, I cut in. She probed in the inside of her toolkit again and dragged out a red change purse, and from that she took a number of bills, all neatly folded and separate. There didn't seem to be much left. She kind of held the purse so I could see how empty it was. "Still no address?" I asked. "I'd rather not." "Call around 4, then. I might have something. And then again, I might not." "I think you're a very offensive person," she said. "No, you don't. You think I'm cute. And I think you're a fascinating little liar. You don't think I'm doing this for any $20, do you?" She gave me a level, suddenly cooled stare. "Then why?" Then when I didn't answer, she added, "Because spring is in the air?" I still didn't answer. She blushed a little, then giggled. I didn't have the heart to tell her I was just plain bored with doing nothing. Perhaps it was the spring, too, and something in her eyes that was much older than Manhattan, Kansas. "I think you're very nice, really," she said softly. Then she turned quickly and almost ran out of the office. I put Orpha Quest's 20 hard-earned dollars in an envelope and dropped it in the desk drawer. I didn't like the idea of running around loose with that much currency on me. You could know Bay City a long time without knowing Idaho Street, and you could know a lot about Idaho Street without knowing number 449. Beside the front door there was a large printed sign, "No vacancies," that had been there a long time. It had become faded and fly-specked. I pushed the bell. It rang somewhere nearby, but nothing happened. I rang it again. The same nothing happened. I prowled along to a door with a black and white metal sign on it, "Manager." I knocked on that. Then I kicked it. Nobody seemed to mind my kicking it. I went around the side where a narrow concrete walk led to the service entrance. There was a dirty garbage pail on a small porch and a wooden box full of liquor bottles. Behind the screen, the back door of the house was open. It was gloomy inside. I could see a straight chair with a man's coat hanging over it, and in the chair a man in shirt sleeves with his hat on. I banged on the screen door. The man paid no attention. I banged again, harder. This time he tilted his chair back and showed me a small, pale face with a cigarette in it. "What you want?" he barked. "Manager?" "Not in, bub." "I want a room." "No vacancies, bub. Can't you read large print?" "I happen to have different information," I said. "Yeah?" He shook ash from a cigarette by flicking it with a nail without removing it from his small, sad mouth. "Go fry your head in it." He tilted his chair forward again and went on doing whatever he was doing. I made noise getting down off the porch, and none whatever coming back up on it. With the open blade of a penknife, I lifted the hook of the door and eased it out of the eye. I stepped into the house. The table in the breakfast nook was covered with money. The little man was counting and stacking it and making entries in a small book. He wetted his pencil without bothering the cigarette that lived in his face. "Rent day?" I asked genially. The small man turned very suddenly. He removed the stub of cigarette from his mouth, dropped it on the floor, and stepped on it. He reached a fresh one out of his shirt and put it in the same hole in his face and started fumbling for a match. "You came in nice," he said pleasantly. Finding no match, he turned casually in his chair and reached into a pocket of his coat. Something heavy knocked against the wood of the chair. I got hold of his wrist before the heavy thing came out of the pocket. He threw his weight backwards, and the pocket of the coat started to lift towards me. I yanked the chair out from under him. I stepped back with his coat and took a .38 out of the pocket he had been playing with. He got up slowly, pretending to be groggier than he was. His hand fumbled at the back of his collar, and light winked on metal as his arm swept towards me. He was a game little rooster. I sideswiped his jaw with his own gun, and he sat down on the floor again. I stepped on the hand that held the knife. It was a long, thin knife, and it looked very sharp. "You ought to be ashamed of yourself," I said, "pulling guns and knives on people that are just looking for a place to live. Even for these times, that's out of line." "Okay," he said, "okay, I ain't supposed to be perfect. Take the dough and beat it, but don't ever think we won't catch up with you." I walked across to the inner door and tried it. It wasn't locked. I turned back. "I'll leave your gun in the mailbox," I said. "Never mind the heater," he said. "The town's full of old iron, but you could leave the skib with Clausen. I done quite a lot of work on it to get it in shape." "And with it?" I asked. "Could be." He flicked the finger at me airily. "Maybe we'll meet again someday soon, when I got a friend with me." "I'll tell him to wear a clean shirt," I said, "and lend you one." I opened the door beyond the kitchen and went through it with the gun and knife in one hand. It was a wall-bed living room with the wall bed down and rumpled. Near this there was a studio couch, and on the studio couch lay a man. His mouth was open and his face was shining with sweat, and he breathed like an old Ford with a leaky head gasket. On the floor beside him, a near-full gin bottle and a cup that seemed to have contained coffee, but not at all recently. The room was full, mostly of gin and bad air, but there was also a reminiscence of marijuana smoke. I went over to a desk. Inside it was the house register, so I leafed back until I came to the name Orrin P. Quest, written in a sharp, meticulous handwriting, and the number 214. I followed on through to the end of the register, but found no new registration for room 214. A party named G.W. Hicks had room 215. I shut the register in the desk and crossed to the couch. I leaned down and gripped the snoring man's nose tight between my first and second fingers, and stuffed a handful of his sweater into his mouth. He stopped snoring and jerked his eyes open. They were glazed and bloodshot. He struggled against my hand. When I was sure he was fully awake, I let go of him, picked up the bottle of gin off the floor, and poured some into a glass that lay on its side near the bottle. I showed the glass to him. His hand came out to it with the beautiful anxiety of a mother welcoming a lost child. I moved it out of his reach and said, "You the manager?" He licked his lips stickily and said, and made a grab for the glass. "Manager?" He nodded and almost fell off the couch. "Must be I'm drunky," he said. He put his feet on the ground and pushed himself upright. He cackled with sudden amusement, took 3 uneven steps, went down on his hands and knees and tried to bite the leg of a chair. I pulled him up on his feet again and gave him a slug of his medicine. "Who the hell are you?" he growled. "I'm looking for a man named Orrin P. Quest." He smeared his face with his hands and said tersely, "Moved away. Give me a drink." I poured another slug of gin and held it out of his reach. "All I want is the present address of Orrin P. Quest." I put the glass down on the floor and got one of my business cards out for him. "This might help you to concentrate." He peered at the card closely, sneered, bent it in half, and bent it again. He held it on the flat of his hand, spat on it, and tossed it over his shoulder. I handed him the glass of gin. He drank to my health. "Beat it," he said. "I got friends." He started for the telephone, clawed the receiver off the hook, and dialed the 5 digits of a number. I watched him. 13572. He put it to his ear and growled at the wall. "Let me talk to Doc. Vince, the Doc." He shook the receiver and threw it away from him. He put his hands down on the floor and started to crawl in a circle. When he saw me, he looked surprised and annoyed. He got shakily to his feet again and held his hand out. "Give me a drink." I retrieved the fallen glass and milked the gin bottle into it. He drank it down with an airy flourish, walked calmly over to the couch and lay down, putting the glass under his head for a pillow. He went to sleep instantly. I felt the man on the couch over and dug some keys out of his pocket. One of them was a pass key. I paused on the way to write Doc, Vince, 13572 on an envelope. Maybe it was a clue. The house was quite silent as I went on up. The manager's much-filed pass key turned the lock of room 214 without noise. I pushed the door open. The room was not empty. "I beg your pardon," I said. "The manager told me this room was vacant." He was as bald as a grapefruit. His hands came up from the pillow, went to his head and down again. He turned and he had hair. It looked as natural as hair ever looked, smooth, brown, not parted. He glared at me from under it. "You can always try knocking," he said. I said, "A man named Orrin P. Quest told me about the room for rent." "That's so?" Not a flicker of an eye. "Friend of yours?" he asked, casually. "We grew up together," I said. We went on staring at each other. "This Quest party's been out of here 10 days, the man said thoughtfully. "So he still thinks the room is vacant, huh?" "According to the register, it is vacant," I said. He made a contemptuous noise. "That rummy downstairs probably ain't looked at the register in a month. Say, wait a minute. I've been kind of dreamy all morning, or I'd have wised up. You're a dick. What's the beef?" "No beef at all. I just wondered why you had the room. I moved from 215 across the hall. This here's a better room." "So you're Hicks?" He looked surprised. "George W. Hicks," I said. "It's in the register, room 215. I got my wallet out and handed him one of my business cards. "He could have went somewhere without telling me," he mused. "Your grammar," I said, "is almost as loose as your toupee." "You lay off my toupee if you know what's good for you," he shouted. "I wasn't going to eat it," I said. "I'm not hungry." He took a step towards me and dropped his right shoulder. A scowl of fury dropped his lip almost as far. "Don't hit me. I'm insured," I told him. "Oh, hell, just another screwball." He shrugged and put his lip back up on his face. "What's the lay?" "I have to find this Orrin P. Quest," I said. After a moment he said, "Okay. I'm a careful guy myself. That's why I'm moving out." "Maybe you don't like reefer smoke." "That," he said emptily, "and other things. That's why Quest left. Respectable type, like me. I'm a retired optometrist." "That why you have the .45 in there?" I pointed to an open suitcase lying on his bed. "Nothing to get cute about," he said sourly. "It's been in the family for years." I reached out and slipped the card from between his fingers and dropped it into my pocket. "Thanks for the time," I said. I went out and closed the door, then stood against it listening. I made noise going down the hall and stood at the head of the stairs. Then I went quietly back to room 215 and used the passkey to enter. I closed and locked the door silently and waited just inside. Not more than 2 minutes passed before Mr. George W. Hicks was on his way. He came out so quietly that I wouldn't have heard him if I hadn't been listening for precisely that kind of movement. I looked down to see Hicks going into the manager's apartment. The door closed behind him. I waited for the sound of voices. No voices. Then I made a pilgrimage into room 214. I searched the room with care and patience and found nothing that connected it in any way with R&P Quest. I didn't expect to. But you always have to look. I went downstairs, listened outside the manager's door, heard nothing, went in and crossed to put the keys on the desk. Lester B. Clausen lay on his side on the couch with his face to the wall, dead to the world. I looked at the register again. The page with R & Quest's registration had been torn out. A careful man, Mr. Hicks. Very careful. I started back to the entrance door. As I reached it, something for the first time penetrated my mind. A drunk like Clausen ought to be snoring very loudly with a nice assortment of checks, gurgles, and snorts. I stood over him and looked down. A square yellow wooden handle was attached to the back of Lester B. Clausen's neck. It was the handle of an ice pick. I did a nice, quiet 35 getting away from the neighborhood. On the edge of the city, I shut myself in an outdoor telephone booth and called the police department. I said, "Number 449 Idaho Street, in the apartment of the manager. His name's Clausen. Got that?" "What makes it important?" a furry voice said without suspicion. "The coroner will want to know," I said, and hung up. I drove back to Hollywood and locked myself in the office with the Bay City telephone book. Then went down to the corner drugstore for a sandwich and a cup of coffee, and used a pay booth to call Dr. Vincent Lagarde, number 13572. His voice was impatient. He was very busy in the middle of an examination, he said. I never knew a doctor who wasn't. Did he know Lester B. Clausen? He never heard of him. What was the purpose of my inquiry? "Mr. Clausen tried to telephone you this morning," I said. "He was too drunk to talk properly." "But I don't know Mr. Clausen," the doctor's cool voice answered. He didn't seem to be in quite such a hurry now. "Just wanted to make sure. Somebody stuck an ice pick into the back of his neck," I said. Dr. Lagarde's voice was now almost unctuously polite. "Has this been reported to the police? And who is this speaking?" "The name is Hicks," I said. "George W. Hicks." "I'm sorry, Mr. Hicks," Dr. Lagarde's voice said, "but I don't know Mr. Clausen." "Thank you, Doctor," I said and hung up. If Dr. Vincent Lagarde was on the level, he would now telephone the Bay City Police Department and tell them the story. If he didn't, he wasn't on the level, which might or might not be useful to know. The phone on my desk rang at 4 o'clock sharp. "Did you find Orrin yet, Mr. Marlowe?" It was Orpha May. "Not yet. Where are you?" "Why, I'm in the drugstore next to—" "Come on up and stop acting like Mata Hari," I said. I hung up and fed myself a slug of Old Forester to brace my nerves for the interview. As I was inhaling it, I heard her steps tripping along the corridor. She came in and seated herself demurely and waited. "All I could find out," I told her, "is that the dump on Idaho Street is peddling reefers. That's marijuana cigarettes." "Why, how disgusting," she said. "Is that all you did all day? Just find Orrin had moved and it was a bad neighborhood?" "Why, I found that out for myself. I paid you $20, Mr. Marlowe. I understand that was in payment of a day's work. It doesn't seem to me that you've done a day's work." "No," I said, "that's true. But the day isn't over yet, and don't bother about the $20. You can have it back if you like. I didn't even bruise it." I didn't mean it like that. I know you're doing the best you can, Mr. Marlowe, with the facts I have. But I've told you all I know." "I don't think so," I said. "I'll tell you what's wrong. I'll skip over your not telling me where you're staying because it might be just that you're afraid I'll show up with a quart of hooch under my arm and make a pass at you. What's really wrong with this picture is that you're not scared, neither you personally nor your mother, and you ought to be scared as hell. She clutched her bag to her bosom with tight little fingers. You mean something has happened to him? I don't know that anything has, but in your position, knowing the kind of guy Aaron was, the way his letters came through and then didn't, I can't see myself waiting for my summer vacation to come around before I start asking questions. I also can't see myself bypassing the police, who have an organization for finding people, and going to a lone wolf operator you never heard of, asking him to root around for you in the rubble. I think you're vile. Don't you dare say Mother and I weren't worried. I pushed the $20 worth of currency a little closer to the other side of the desk. You were worried $20 worth, honey, I said, but about what, I wouldn't know. Just put this hunk of the folding back in your saddlebag and forget you ever met me. She snapped her bag shut viciously on the money. I'm not very likely to forget your rudeness. I stood up. Don't think about it too much. You might get to like it. I reached up and twitched her glasses off. She took half a step back, almost stumbled, and I reached an arm around her by pure instinct. Her eyes widened, and she put her hands against my chest and pushed. I've been pushed harder by a kitten. Without the cheaters, those eyes are really something, I said in an awed voice. She relaxed and let her head go back and her lips open a little. I suppose you do that to all the clients, she said softly. Her lips came open a little farther. On them appeared the faint, provocative smile that nobody ever has to teach them. She reached a quick arm around my neck and started to pull. So I kissed her. It was either that or slug her. She giggled and disengaged herself gracefully. I guess you think I've been kissed lots of times, she said. What girl hasn't? We looked at each other then with no particular expression. Well, she began at last. I handed her back her glasses. She pulled them on. She opened her bag, looked at herself in a small mirror, rooted around in her bag, and came out with her hand clenched. I'm sorry I was mean, she said, and pushed something under the blotter of my desk. I'll call you, she said intimately, and out she went, tap, 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 down the hall. I went over and lifted the blotter and smoothed out the crumpled currency that lay under it. Then the phone rang. You Marlowe, it said. Speaking. You got a safe deposit box, Marlowe? I had enough of being polite for one afternoon. Stop asking and start telling, I said. If you got a proposition, state it, and I get called mister until you give me some money. Don't let that temper ride you so hard, friend. I'm in a jam. I need help. I need something kept in a safe place, for a few days, not longer, and for that you make a little quick money. How little, I ask, and how quick? A C-note. Right here and waiting. I'm warming it up for you, room 332, Van Nuys Hotel. What is it you want me to keep? That'll wait till you get here. Then the voice changed. How's every little thing in Bay City? It was a dim chuckle over the wire. Thought that might interest you, Marlowe. It took me 29 minutes to get to the Van Nuys Hotel. When I got there, I strolled over to the cigar counter in the corner and put down a quarter for a package of Camels. The girl behind the counter was a straw blonde with a long neck and tired eyes. Who's the housekeeper here now? I asked her. She did something slow and elegant to the back of her head, exhibiting what seemed like more than one handful of blood-red fingernails in the process. Mr. Flack is on days. It's day now, so it would be Mr. Flack would be on. Where could I find him? It's down along that corridor there, next to the porter's room. You can't miss the porter's room on account of it has a half door and says porter on the upper part in gold letters. Only that half is folded back like, so I guess maybe you can't see it. I'll see it, I said, even if I have to get a hinge screwed to my neck. He's not interesting, she said. Why bother? Business, I said, and made off before she threw a half Nelson on me. The door to Flack's office was half open. A man was sitting at a small desk which had dust on it. I sat down across from him and put a card on the desk. He reached for the card without excitement, read it, turned it over, and read the back with as much care as the front. There was nothing on the back to read. Then he picked up half a cigar out of his ashtray and burned his nose lighting it. "What's the gripe?" he growled at me. "No gripe." "You Flack?" He didn't bother to answer. "Like to get a line on one of the customers," I said. "He's in room 332. I had a call from him. He wanted to see me." "Am I stopping you?" "Look, Flack, the whole thing could be a nice way to get me into a hotel room and knock me off and then quietly check out. You wouldn't want anything like that to happen in your hotel, would you, Flack?" "Supposing I cared," he said. "You figure you're that important?" I said, "Do you smoke that piece of rope because you like it or because you think it makes you tough?" He made a sad sound, got up wearily, and went out of the room. He came back in a short time and dropped a registration card on the desk. Dr. G. W. Hambleton, El Centro, California, was written on it. I nodded and went out. Room 332 was at the back of the building near the door to the fire escape. I knocked the 2 longs and 2 shorts as instructed. Nothing happened. Then I turned the knob and walked in. The upper half of the bed was in view, and a man lay on it in shirt and pants. "Dr. Hambleton?" I said. The man didn't answer. A woman who had been in the bathroom was standing there holding a towel in front of the lower part of her face. Dark glasses showed above the towel and fluffed-out blonde hair. She wore gauntleted gloves, and there was an automatic in her right hand. White bone grip, looked like a .32. "Turn around and put your hands behind you," she said. I did it. A gun muzzle poked into the back of my neck. The gun against my neck went away, and a white flame burned for an instant behind my eyes. I grunted and fell forward on my hands and knees and reached back quickly. My hand touched a leg in a nylon stocking, but it slipped off, which seemed a pity. It felt like a nice leg. The jar of another blow on my head took the pleasure out of this. I collapsed on the floor. The door opened, the door closed. Silence. I climbed to my feet and went into the bathroom and stood there patting the bruise with a towel and wondering why I didn't run after her screaming. I saw the upper part of a can of talcum had been pried off the shoulder. A toothpaste tube had been cut open. Someone had been looking for something. I went back to the little hallway and towards the man on the bed. He'd not moved during all this time for a somewhat obvious reason. He was wearing a toupee. The last time I talked to him, his name had been George W. Hicks. There was no blood, none at all, which is one of the few nice things about an expert ice-pick job. I turned away and looked the room over. The desk had been searched. The point of interest now was whether the people who had ice-picked Dr. Hambleton had found what they came for. They had had very little time. I searched the room carefully. Then I searched Dr. Hambleton himself. Loose change, a small tube of dental floss, 7 printed cards reading Dr. G. W. Hambleton, El Centro, California, and $164 in currency in his wallet. I put the wallet back where I found it. This was the take. If the killers knew what they were looking for, it was something that could be hidden in a book, a tube of toothpaste, or a hatband. I grinned suddenly, bent over and quickly, and with the grin still on my face, out of place as it was, pulled off Dr. Hambleton's toupee. A piece of orange-colored paper was fastened by Scotch tape, protected by a square of cellophane. I pulled it loose, turned it over, and saw that it was a numbered claim check belonging to the Bay City Camera Shop. I put it in my wallet and put the toupee carefully back on the dead egg-bald head. I left the room unlocked because I had no way to lock it. I found a telephone and called the Bay City Camera Shop. The man said, "Yes, Mr. Hicks, we have them for you. 6 enlarged prints on glossy from your negative." "I'll pick them up in the morning, thanks." I hung up. I folded the orange Camera Shop check into a sheet of hotel stationery and addressed an envelope to myself. I put a special delivery stamp on it and dropped it in the mail. Then I went along to Flack's office again. "Dr. Hambleton doesn't answer his door," I said. "What should I do, bust my girdle?" Flack said irritably. "You said he wasn't in, so what?" I didn't say he wasn't in. I said he didn't answer his door. Maybe he'd like to run up and look. Maybe he didn't see a first-class ice-pick job lately. Flack put his hands on the arms of his chair and squeezed the wood hard. "Oh," he said painfully. Then he put his hat on firmly and jerked a thumb at the door. We went up to the third floor in silence. He tried the door. He looked back at me with a twisted mouth. "You said the door wasn't locked," he complained, "but it is now." He unlocked the door. He listened, then stepped back and kicked the door open and brought the gun up hard and straight, like the wicked foreman of the Lazy Q. "Let's go," he said out of the corner of his mouth. Flack leaned forward and edged cautiously into the room. He reached the bathroom door and put his eye to the crack, then pushed the door open until it bounced against the tub. He tried the closet door, leveled his gun, and jerked it wide open. No suspects in the closet. "Look under the bed," I said. Flack bent swiftly and looked under the bed. "Look under the carpet," I said. "You kidding me?" Flack added nastily. "I just like to watch you work." He bent over the dead man and studied the ice pick. "Well, I guess it's the cops," he said slowly. "No chance to cover up on this one." Detective Lieutenant Christy French growled after the intern who had filled out the DOA form on Dr. Hamilton. "What a stiff means to those birds is what a plate of warmed-up cabbage means to me." His partner, a cop named Fred Bifus, was down on one knee by the telephone box. He had dusted it for fingerprints. "Gray cotton undertaker's gloves," he said disgustedly. "Fat lot of good printing this joint." French said, "I didn't expect prints. These ice-pick jobs are a specialty." Flack was sitting in a chair by the window looking out morosely. I was leaning against the bathroom wall and sorting out my fingers. Flack said suddenly, "I figure an ice-pick job's a dame's work. You can buy 'em anywhere, 10 cents. If you want one fast, you can slip it down inside a garter and let it hang there." Christy French gave him a brief glance which had a kind of wonder in it. Bifus said, "What kind of dames you been running around with, honey? The way stockings cost nowadays, a dame would as soon stick a saw down her sock." "Never thought of that," Flack said. Bifus said, "Leave us do the thinking, sweetheart. It takes equipment." Christy French said, "Whoever did this one was a performer. He got the spinal cord the first try. Now, Sonny Mo Stein's boys specialized in it, but they run it into the ground. It got so you couldn't walk across a vacant lot without finding some of their work. Then they came out here, what was left of them. Funny thing, though," he continued dreamily. "When Weepy Moyer had the chill put on Sonny Mo Stein over on the Franklin Avenue last February, the killer used a gun. Mo wouldn't have liked that at all." "Who's Weepy Moyer?" Flack asked. "He was next to Mo in the organization," French told them. "This could easily be his work, not that he'd have done it personal." "Why not?" Flack asked sourly. "Don't you guys ever read a paper? Moyer's a gentleman now. He knows the nicest people, even has another name. And as for the Sonny Mo Stein job, it just happened we had him in jail on a gambling rap. We didn't get anywhere. But we did make him a very sweet alibi. Anyhow, he's a gentleman now, like I said, and gentlemen don't go around sticking ice picks into people. They hire it done." French eyed me slowly. "Just between us girls in the powder room," he said, "we never even proved the guy we had was Moyer, but don't broadcast it." He leaned casually against the corpse's leg, lit a cigarette, and pointed with it. "That's enough time on the vaudeville circuit. Here's what we got, Fred. First off, the customer here was not too bright. He had the cards printed with an El Centro address and a phone number. It took just 2 minutes to find out there ain't any such address or any such phone number, okay? He's got 14 smackaroos folding in here and about $2 loose change. On his key ring, he don't have any car key or any safe deposit key or any house key. All he's got is a suitcase key and 7 filed Yale master keys, filed fairly recently at that. I figure he was planning to sneak the hotel a little." He turned to Flack. "Any chance to check his visitors?" Flack shook his head gloomily. "You don't even have to pass the desk to get to the elevators." "All right," French said. "Whoever knocked him off could come and go without any questions asked, and that's about all we know. Okay, Fred?" Bifus nodded. I said, "Not quite all." It's a nice toupee, but it's still a toupee. French and Bifus both swung around quickly. French reached carefully, removed the dead man's hair, and whistled. I wondered what that damn intern was grinning at, he said. The bastard didn't even mention it. See what I see, Fred? All I see is a guy without no hair, Bifus answered. Maybe you never knew him at that. Mile Away Marston used to be a runner for Ace DeVore. Why, sure enough, Bifus chuckled. How you been all this time, Mile Away? I didn't see you in so long I forgot. French said calmly, well, that takes a load off my mind. This punk ain't going to be no 24-hour-a-day job. The hell with him. He replaced the toupee over one eye and stood up off the bed. That's all for you two, he said to Flack and me. Flack stood up, then went down the short hall. I walked along with him to his little office. I followed him in and shut the door. He seemed surprised. I got business to attend to, he said throatily. Beat it and keep going. Such a tough little man, I said. Dr. Hambleton had $164 currency in his wallet when I searched him. He promised me $100 as retainer, remember? Now in the same wallet he has $14, and I did leave the door of his room unlocked, and somebody else locked it. You locked it, Flack. He looked up at me. 50-50, huh? I said I want the whole 150. He hunched down in his chair and stared at a corner of the desk. After a long time, he sighed. He put the two piles together and pushed them over to my side of the desk. It wasn't going to do him any good, Flack said. I picked up the money, counted it, and threw it back at him. Here, I don't want the money. I want something else. He stared at me with his mouth open. He reached for it and crammed it back in his wallet. What's something else? The fat sneer he lived with was coming home again, slowly but gladly. All right, I said, it was a woman. She must have been up there while he was dead, but why would she take his key? Why do something with that key that would connect her with that room? Unless, of course, she was seen to leave the room and followed out of the hotel. I leaned down and pulled the telephone towards me. I better call Christie and get this over with. Maybe she did kill him. I can't cover up for a murderer. I took the receiver off the hook. Flack slammed his moist paw down hard on top of my hand. Lay off, he said with almost a sob. I followed her to a car parked down the street. Okay, got the number. Christ's sake, pal, give me some kind of a break. He looked down and played solitaire with some dirty envelopes. Finally selected one and tossed it over to me. License number, he said wearily. I looked down at the envelope. There was a scrawled license number on it, all right. Ill-written and faint and oblique, the way it would be written hastily on a paper held in a man's hand on the street. 6N333, California, 1947. I tore the number off and tossed the envelope back to him. 4P327, I said, watching his eyes. Nothing flicked in them. No trace of derision or concealment. But how do I know this isn't some license number you had already? You just got to take my word for it. Describe the woman. Want a lot for your dough, don't you, Peeper? Dr. Hambleton's dough. He winced. All right. Blonde, white coat with some colored stitching on it, dark glasses. What was that license number again, Flacky? I caught him off guard. Which one, he said. I did some staring into his eyes. Go on, beat it, he said between his teeth. Tell the cops I frisked the stiff. So what? Maybe I get tossed in the fishbowl. So what? When I come out, I'm solid. Don't think for a minute those dark cheaters fool little Flacky. I've seen too many movies to miss that lovely puss. And if you ask me, that babe will be around for a long time. She's a comer. And who knows, he leered at me triumphantly, she'll need a bodyguard one of these days. Then he sat there and stared at me with his nasty little eyes. I left him to his thoughts, which were probably as small, ugly, and frightened as the man himself. The apartment house was over on Doheny Drive, just down the hill from the Strip. There were mailboxes and bells in the imitation marble foyer. 3 out of the 16 had no names over them. The names that I read meant nothing to me. The job needed a little more work. I dialed a man named Peoria Smith, who was so called because he stuttered. Another little mystery I hadn't time to work out. Mavis Weld, I said. Phone number. This is Marlowe. Sure, he said. Mavis Weld, huh? How much? Be 10 bucks, he said. Just forget I called, I said. The address goes with it naturally, Peoria whined, forgetting to stutter. $5, I said. I got the address already. He gave it to me. I dialed again. After 2 rings, a drawling, sexy voice answered. Yes? The voice cooed. Miss Weld, please. And who's calling, Miss Weld, if you please? I have some stills Whitey wants me to deliver tonight. Miss Weld's taking a bath, she laughed. I guess it was a silvery tinkle where she was. It sounded like somebody putting away saucepans where I was. But of course, bring up the photographs. I'm sure she's dying to see 'em. The apartment number's 14. I pushed the bell to number 14. A tall girl in jock furs opened the door. Sexy, with very faint praise for her. She looked sharply down at my empty hands. Studio stills are usually a little too big to put in your pocket. Are you quite sure you have the stills, amigo? As sure as I'll ever be. Your last picture was wonderful, Miss Gonzalez. A smile flashed like lightning and changed her whole face. But it was stinking, she glowed. Nothing with you in it stinks for me, Miss Gonzalez. She stood away from the door and waved me in. We'll have a drink, she said. I adore flattery, however dishonest. I went in. She made a couple of drinks and a couple of glasses you almost could have stood umbrellas in. You may call me Dolores if you wish, she said, taking a hearty swig out of her own tumbler. And what may I call you? I grinned. Of course, she said. I inhaled a couple of inches of my liquor. You are an amusing son of a bitch, she said with a shrug, and went off through the arch, carrying her half-quart of scotch and water with her. I heard a gentle tapping on a door and her voice. Darling, there's a man here who says he has some stills from the studio. He says, muy simpático, muy guapo también, con cojones. A voice I'd heard before said sharply, Shut up, you little bitch, I'll be out in a second. The Gonzalez came back through the archway humming. Her glass was empty. She went to the bar again. But you are not drinking, she cried, looking at my glass. I ate dinner. I only have a 2-quart stomach anyway. I understand a little Spanish. She tossed her head. You're shocked. No, but if I wanted to be shocked, I'd know right where to come. But I do not live here, she said. I live at the Chateau Bercy. Alone? She slapped me delicately across the tip of my nose. The next thing I knew, I had her in my lap and she was trying to bite a piece off my tongue. You are a very sweet son of a bitch, she said. Her mouth was as hot as ever a mouth was. I felt her hand in my breast pocket. I shoved her off hard, but she had my wallet. She danced away with it, laughing, flicked it open, and went through it with fingers that darted like little snakes. So glad you two got acquainted, a voice off to one side said coolly. Mavis Weld stood in the archway, wearing a short hostess gown and little else. She was the same girl, all right, dark glasses on or off. The Gonzalez gave her a quick darting glance, closed my wallet, and tossed it. She strolled to a table and picked up a black bag with a long strap, hooked it over her shoulder, and moved towards the door. The name's Philip Marlowe, she said to Mavis Weld. Nice, don't you think? I didn't know you bothered to ask them their names, Mavis Weld said. You so seldom know them long enough. Open the door, honey. This is the day we put the garbage out. The Gonzalez looked back at her slowly, levelly, and with a knife in her eyes. Then she left. Now suppose you do the same, but more quietly, she said. I got out a handkerchief and scrubbed the lipstick off my face. It looked exactly the color of blood, fresh blood. That could happen to anybody, I said. I wasn't petting her, she was petting me. I came here on business, Miss Weld. Look, little man, do I have to call the manager to bounce you downstairs like a basketball? I went over and pushed the door shut. She stood her ground, one hand reaching for the doorknob, her eyes full of dark blue rage. If you're going to stand that close to me, I said, maybe you'd better put some clothes on. She took her hand back and swung it hard. "Did I hurt you?" she asked softly. I nodded. "That's fine." She hauled off and slapped me again, harder if anything. "I think you'd better kiss me," she breathed. Her eyes were clear and limpid and melting. I glanced down casually. Her right hand was balled into a very businesslike fist. It wasn't too small to work with either. "Believe me," I said, "there's only one reason I don't. Even if you had your little black gun with you or the brass knuckles you probably keep on your night table." She smiled politely. "Look," I said, "you're going to find this hard to believe, but I came over here with the quaint idea that you might be a girl who needed some help, and would find it rather hard to get anyone you could bank on. I figured you went to that hotel room to make some kind of a payoff, and the fact that you went by yourself and took chances of being recognized, and were recognized by a house dick whose standards of ethics would take about as much strain as a very tired old cobweb, all this made me think you might be in one of those Hollywood jams that really mean curtains. But you're not in any jam. You're right up front, under the baby spot, pulling every tired ham gesture you ever used in the most tired B-picture you ever acted in, if acting is the word." "Shut up," she said between teeth so tight they grated. "Shut up, you slimy, blackmailing keyhole peeper." "You don't need me," I said. "You don't need anybody. You're so goddamn smart you could talk your way out of a safe deposit box. Okay, go ahead and talk your way out. I won't stop you. Just don't make me listen to it. I burst out crying to think a mere slip of an innocent little girl like you should be so clever. You do things to me, honey, just like Margaret O'Brien." She didn't move or breathe when I reached the door, nor when I opened it. I don't know why. Stuff wasn't that good. I went down the stairs and across the court and out of the front door, almost bumping into a slim, dark-eyed man who was standing there lighting a cigarette. I started to go around him, then I noticed that his lifted right hand held a key. I reached out and snapped it out of his hand for no reason at all. I looked at the number stamped on it, number 14, Mavis Weld's apartment. "You don't need that," I said. "The door isn't locked." "Of course," he said. There was a peculiar smile on his face. How stupid of me. "Yeah," I said, "we're both stupid. Anybody stupid that bothers with that tramp." "I wouldn't quite say that," he answered quietly. "Well, since Miss Weld is a friend in common, may I introduce myself? My name is Steelgrave. Haven't I seen you somewhere?" "No, you haven't seen me anywhere, Mr. Steelgrave," I said. "My name's Marlowe. It's extremely unlikely that we've met, and strange to relate, I never heard of you, Mr. Steelgrave, and I wouldn't give a damn even if your name was Weepy Moyer." There was nothing to make me say it, except that the name had been mentioned. A peculiar stillness came over his face, a peculiar fixed look in his silent black eyes. Weepy Moyer. Peculiar name. I don't think I ever heard that. Is he somebody I should know? Not unless you're unusually fond of ice picks, I said, and left him. He just stood there. I got in my car and drove off. Here we go again. "You're not human tonight, Marlowe." Why should I be? I meet nice people with and without ice picks in their necks, and I don't tell the cops. Why? Who am I cutting my throat for this time? A blonde with sexy eyes and too many door keys? A girl from Manhattan, Kansas? I don't know. All I know is that something isn't what it seems, and the old, tired but always reliable hunch tells me that if the hand is played the way it's dealt, the wrong person is going to lose the pot. Is that my business? Well, what is my business? Do I know? Did I ever know? Let's not get into that. You're not human tonight, Marlowe. I had a reason for going back to the office. A special delivery letter with an orange claim check ought to have arrived there by now. I let myself into my dark office and sat there at the desk doing nothing, not even thinking. No special delivery letter. Then the phone rang. I let it ring. I had had enough for one day. I just didn't care. It could have been the Queen of Sheba with her cellophane pajamas on or off. I was just too tired to bother. I got up to leave. It was still ringing as I reached the door. No use. I had to go back. Instinct was stronger than weariness. I lifted the receiver. Orpha Mae Quest's twittery little voice said, "Oh, Mr. Marlowe, I've been trying to get you for just the longest time. I'm so upset." "In the morning," I said. "The office is closed." "Please, Mr. Marlowe, it's terribly important." "Uh-huh." She sniffed. You kissed me." "I've kissed better since," I said. "I've heard from Orrin," she said. That stopped me for a moment. Then I laughed. "You're a nice little liar." I said. "Goodbye." "But really I have. He called me." "Fine," I said. "Then you don't need a detective at all." "Very well, Mr. Marlowe. I'm ready to call the police now. But I don't think you'll like it." "Why?" "Because there's murder in it, Mr. Marlowe." "Come on up," I said. "I'll wait." I hung up and got the bottle of Old Forester out. She came in briskly enough this time. Her motions were small and quick and determined. "About this murder," I said. "Anybody I know? I can see you're not murdered yet." "Please don't be unnecessarily horrid." "It's not my fault. You doubted me over the telephone, so I had to convince you. Orrin did call me up, but he wouldn't tell me where he was or what he was doing. I don't know why." "Who was murdered?" I said. "Or is that a secret, too?" "That horrid man in the rooming house was murdered, Mr. Oh, I forget his name." "Look, Orpha Mae, I'm not asking how you know all this, or rather how Orrin knows it all, or if he does know it. You found him. That's what you wanted me to do, or he's found you, which comes to much the same thing." "It's not the same thing," she cried. "I haven't really found him. He wouldn't tell me where he was living. He wouldn't tell me really anything." "Just about murder," I said, huh? Trifles like that." She laughed, bubblingly. "I just said that to scare you. I don't really mean anybody was murdered, Mr. Marlowe." I took a couple of deep breaths and looked down at my hands. "Are you mad at me?" she asked timidly. "I ought to slap your face off," I said, "and quit acting innocent, or it mightn't be your face I'd slap. Get the hell out of here. You think I enjoy being scared to death?" "Goodness," she said. "I'm sure I didn't know you scared that easy. I thought you were tough." "That's just an act," I growled. "I'm all mush inside." I took hold of her arm and yanked her to her feet. Her head went back, her lips parted. I was hell with the women that day. "But you will find Orrin for me, won't you?" she whispered. "Perfume," I said, sniffing. "Why, you little darling." Her eyes were melting. I was afraid to take her glasses off. Might have socked her in the nose. "Yeah," I said in a voice that sounded like Orson Welles with his mouth full of crackers. "I'll find him for you, honey, if he's still alive, and for free. Not a dime of expense involved. I only ask one thing." "What, Philip?" she asked softly and opened her lips a little wider. "Who was the black sheep in your family?" She jerked away from me and stared at me stony-faced. "You said Orrin wasn't the black sheep in your family, remember? And when you mentioned your sister Lila, you sort of passed on quickly as if the subject was distasteful." I don't remember saying anything like that," she said very slowly. "So I was wondering," I said. "What name does your sister Lila use in pictures?" "Why, I never said she was in pictures." I gave her my big, homely, lopsided grin. She suddenly flew into a rage. "Mind your own business about my sister Lila." She spat at me. "I hate you!" Then she rushed to the door and yanked it open and went out. 8:45 the next morning found me parked a couple of doors from the Bay City camera shop. A neat-appearing young guy in glasses fixed the lock on the door, and I went in with the black and orange check Dr. G.W. Hambleton had pasted to the inside of his toupee. I went back out and sat in my car and looked over the catch. The prints showed a man and a blonde girl sitting in a crowded booth in a restaurant with food in front of them. They were looking up as though their attention had suddenly been attracted, and they had only just had time to react before the camera had clicked. The girl was Mavis Weld. I didn't recognize the man. I figure it must have been the hidden camera trick, and it wasn't too hard for me to guess who had taken the picture. Mr. R&P Quest must have moved fast and smooth to get out of there with his face still in front of his head. I drove back to Los Angeles and went up to the office to look at my mail and lock my catch from the Bay City camera shop up in the battered green safe. All but one print. I sat down at the desk and studied this through a magnifying glass. There was an evening paper, a news chronicle lying on the table in front of the dark, thin, expressionless man who sat beside Mavis Weld. I could just read the headline. Light heavyweight contender succumbs to ring injuries. Only a noon or late sports edition would use a headline like that. I pulled the phone towards me. I dialed the News Chronicle and asked for the sports section. 4 minutes later, I wrote on a pad, "The News Chronicle Noon Sports Edition for February 20th carried the headline." I dialed the same number again and asked for Kenny Haste in the city room. He was an ex-crime reporter I had known for years. We chatted around for a minute, and then I said, "Got any details on the Sonny Mo Stein killing?" "Sure. He was shot twice in the head, in his car about 2 blocks from the Chateau Bercy on Franklin. Time about 11:15 p.m. "Date February 20th, I said, or was it?" "Check, it was. What's in it?" "Wasn't a pal of his supposed to be in town about that time?" "Nothing here says so. What name?" "Weepy Moyer. A cop friend of mine said something about a Hollywood money man being held on suspicion and then released for lack of evidence." Kenny said, "Wait a minute, something's coming back to me. Yeah, fella named Steelgrave owns the dancers, supposed to be a gambler and so on. Nice guy. I've met him. That was a bust." "How do you mean a bust?" "Well, some smart monkey tipped the cops he was Weepy Moyer, and they held him for 10 days on an open charge for Cleveland. Cleveland brushed it off. That didn't have anything to do with the Stein killing. Steelgrave was under glass all that week. No connection at all. Your cop friend has been reading pulp magazines." "They all do," I said. "That's why they talk so tough." We said goodbye and hung up, and after a while I took scissors and cut out the piece that contained the folded newspaper with the headline. I put 2 pieces in separate envelopes and put them in my pocket with the sheet from the pad. I made another phone call and found out who Mavis Weld's agent was. I went down to the parking lot and got my car out. Then I drove to Sheridan Ballou, Inc. Over the door was a fan light with the name in black wooden letters, severely stylized. I walked directly into the reception room. There was flowered carpet and a lot of people waiting to see Mr. Sheridan Ballou. A dangerous-looking redhead sat languidly at a desk talking into a pure white telephone. I went over there and she put a couple of cold blue pellets into me with her eyes and then stared at the cornice that ran around the room. "Good morning. I'd like to see Mr. Ballou," I said, and slipped her one of my plain cards. "Today?" she said amiably. "This week?" "Well, how long does it usually take?" "It has taken 6 months," she said cheerfully. "Can't someone else help you?" "I've got to see him," I said. She smiled beautifully. "Everyone has," she said. "Why, Mr. Marlowe, look at all these lovely people, every one of them who's been here since the office opened 2 hours ago." "This is important." "No doubt." "In what way, if I may ask?" "I want to peddle a little dirt." "Peddle? You mean for money? In Hollywood?" "Could be. Blackmail, in short." She sighed. "Why the hell don't you lamb out of here, bud?" Without turning her head, she said sharply, "Miss Vane." A dark girl came over. The redhead handed her my card and said, "Spink." Miss Vane made a chin jerk at me. I went past her. "This way, second on the right." A plump, white-haired Jew sat at the desk, smiling at me tenderly. "Greetings," he said. "I'm Moss Spink. What's on the thinker, pal? Park the body. Your name's Marlowe, huh? Have I ever heard of anybody named Marlowe?" "Probably not," I said. "I never heard of anybody named Spink." I asked to see a man named Ballou. Does that sound like Spink? Now be reasonable, pal. Sherry Ballou's a very busy guy. Sit down and talk it out with little Spinky. You're what around here? I ask him. I'm his protection, pal. I gotta protect him. I see people for him. I'm the same as him. Up to a point, you understand. Well, could be I'm past the point you're up to, I said. Could be, Spink agreed pleasantly. Give with a little of the old trust and friendliness. Spill the dirt to little Spinky, huh? I drew an envelope from my pocket and tossed it across the desk to him. He pulled the single photograph from it and stared at it solemnly. He looked up at me, down at the photo, up at me. Well, he said, what's it got that's so wonderful? Do I have to tell you who the girl is? Who's the guy? Spink snapped. I said nothing. I said, who's the guy? Spink almost yelled at me. Cough up, Mug, cough up. I still didn't say anything. He got up slowly and went out with the photograph. After a while, Spink came back and gestured to me. We went down 3 carpeted steps into an office that had everything in it but a swimming pool. A man was lying on one of the couches. A white cloth was over his eyes and forehead, and a lissome blonde girl was wringing out another in a silver bowl of ice water at a table beside him. Spink said, This the boy, Sherry. Name Marlowe. I said nothing. Come on, Lug, snap it up. Spink's voice cut in furiously. Sherry don't have all day, you. What would he do with the rest of the day, I heard myself asking. Sit on a white satin couch and have his toenails gilded? The blonde turned suddenly and stared at me. Spink's mouth fell open. He blinked. The man on the couch lifted a slow hand to the corner of the towel over his eyes. You can't talk like that in here, Spink said in a tough voice. I stood up. I said, I forgot to bring my prayer book. This is the first time I knew God worked on commission. Nobody said anything for a minute. Then the man on the couch said calmly, Get the hell out of here, darlings. All but the new chum. Spink gave me a narrow glare of hate. The blonde left silently. The man on the couch listened to the door close and then said, How much? He picked up the photo that Spink had put down near him on a long, low table. He reached out a languid hand. The piece that's cut out would be the punchline, no doubt, he said. I got the envelope out of my pocket and gave him the cut-out corner, watched him fit the 2 pieces together. What were you thinking of asking, Mr. Marlowe? For what? All the prints in the negative. The works. 10 grand, I said, and watched his mouth. The mouth smiled rather pleasantly. It needs a little more explanation, doesn't it? All I see is 2 people having lunch in a public place. Hardly disastrous to the reputation of my client. I assume that was what you had in mind, but we won't talk about any 10 grand. She hasn't got it. She only makes $1 grand a week so far. I admit she's very close to the big money, though. That would stop her cold, I said, pointing to the photo. He laughed contemptuously. Okay if I show this to the Johns downtown, then, I said. He stopped laughing. His eyes narrowed. Very quietly he asked, Why would they be interested? Let's see who you are, Sonny. He put his hand out. I dropped my open wallet into it. He read the photostat of my license, then handed it back. What would happen if you did show your little picture to the cops? I'd first of all have to connect it up with something they're working on, something that happened in the Van Nuys Hotel yesterday afternoon. I'd connect it up through the girl. She won't talk to me, that's why I'm talking to you. She told me about it last night, he sighed. Told you how much, I asked. That a private detective named Marlowe had tried to force her to hire him on the grounds that she was seen in a downtown hotel inconveniently close to where a murder was committed. You amuse the hell out of me, Marlowe. Really, you do. You're so transparent. You're trying to use me for a shovel to dig yourself out of a jam. There's some truth in that. But the jam I'm in is nothing to the jam your client would be in if I hadn't done the thing that put me in the jam. She also told you that if somebody didn't shut my mouth, she'd be in a lot of trouble. He nodded. and said, "We got to where you were taking that to the cops." What then? I don't think we got that far. We got to why she took this up with you instead of with her boyfriend. He arrived just as I left. He has his own key. I pointed to the photograph. The man that took that is missing and can't be found. He's probably dead. 2 other men who lived at the same address are dead. One of them was trying to peddle those pictures just before he got dead. She went to his hotel in person to take delivery. So did whoever killed him. She didn't get delivery, and neither did the killer. They didn't know where to look. And you did? I was lucky. I'd seen him without his toupee. She wanted that picture. Getting it was worth an awful chance. Why? It's just 2 people having lunch on a certain day. The day Moe Stein was shot to death on Franklin Avenue. The day a character named Steelgrave was in jail because the cops got a tip he was a Cleveland Red Hot named Weepy Moyer. That's what the record shows, but the photo says he was out of jail. And by saying that about him on that particular day, it says who he is, and she knows it, and he still has her door key. You don't really want the cops to have that picture, do you? Win, lose, or draw, they'd crucify her. And when it was all over, it wouldn't make a damn bit of difference whether Steelgrave was Moyer. If he got away with it, there'd always be enough people to think it was a fix. She wouldn't get away with anything. She's a gangster's girl in the public mind. And as far as your business is concerned, she's definitely and completely through. What do you really want? Baloo's voice was thin and bitter now. What I wanted from her and couldn't get. Something that gives me a colorable right to act in her interests up to the point where I decided I can't go any farther. By suppressing evidence? He asked tightly. If it is evidence. The cops couldn't find out without smearing Miss Weld. Maybe I can. They wouldn't be bothered to try. They don't care enough. I do. Why? Let's say it's the way I earn my living. I might have other motives, but that one's enough. What's your price? A signed letter employing my services to investigate an attempt to blackmail one of your clients. Pretty sure of yourself, aren't you, Marlowe? I only wish I was. Press that button on the end of the desk, will you? I pressed it. The black glass doors opened and a dark girl came in with a stenographer's notebook. Without looking at her, Baloo began to dictate. Letter to Mr. Philip Marlowe. This agency herewith employs you to investigate an attempt to blackmail one of its clients, particulars of which have been given to you verbally. Blah, blah, blah. That's all, Eileen. Right away, please. I gave the girl my address, and she went out. Here, you'd better keep this. He held out the 2 pieces of the photograph. 5 minutes later, I left. The redhead at the front desk gave me her Saturday night smile. Miss Vane beamed at me. I had been 40 minutes with the boss. The studio cop at the semicircular glassed-in desk put down his telephone and scribbled on a pad. He tore off the sheet and pushed it through the narrow slit not more than 3/4 of an inch wide where the glass did not quite meet the top of his desk. His voice, coming through the speaking device set into the glass panel, had a metallic ring. Straight through to the end of the corridor, he said. George Wilson will pick you up there. Oh, brother, if a gun was all it took. I went over to an olive green door that didn't have any handle. It made a buzzing sound and let me push it open. Beyond was an olive green corridor with bare walls and a door at the far end. A rat trap. I turned to find that a tall, sandy-haired man with a nose like a strap-hanger's elbow had sneaked up on me. I'm George Wilson. Just what can I do for you, Mr. Marlowe? I want to see Mavis Weld. She's on the set. She's in a picture that's shooting. I held my pass out to him and he looked it over. Baloo sent you. He's her agent. I guess we can manage. Stage 12. Want to go over there now? If you have time. I'm the unit publicity man. That's what my time is for. Wilson pulled a heavy door open and I went in past him. Inside was another door. Inside that, what seemed after the sunlight to be pitch darkness. Then I saw a concentration of lights in the far corner. The rest of the enormous soundstage seemed to be empty. We went toward the lights. A voice was shouting, "Roll 'em!" A bell rang loudly. As we came around the corner of the set, we saw what it was. The deck of a pleasure yacht near the stern. There were 2 girls and 3 men in the scene. One of the girls was Mavis Weld. She wore a wet white sharkskin swimsuit and had evidently just come aboard. A makeup man was spraying water on her face and arms and the edges of her blonde hair. The scene went through without a hitch. "Cut!" someone yelled. "Print that one. Break for lunch, everybody." The actors came down a flight of rough wooden steps and nodded to Wilson. Mavis Weld came last, having stopped to put on a terry-cloth robe and a pair of beach sandals. She stopped dead when she saw me. Wilson stepped forward. "Mr. Marlowe would like a few words with you, okay?" "Mr. Marlowe?" Wilson gave me a quick, sharp look. "From Ballew's office. I supposed you knew him." I may have seen him. She was still staring at me. "What is it?" I didn't speak. After a moment she said, "Thanks, George. You'd better come along to my dressing room, Mr. Marlowe." She turned and walked off around the far side of the set. A green and white dressing room stood against the wall. The name on the door was Miss Weld. "Somebody let you in here. Who? Why? That takes explaining." "I'm working for you. I've been paid a retainer and Ballew has the receipt." "How very thoughtful. And suppose I don't want you to work for me, whatever your work is." "Okay, be fancy," I said. I took the photo out of my pocket and held it out. She looked at me a long and steady moment before she dropped her eyes. "Well?" she asked. "I have the negative and some other prints. You would have had them if you had had more time and known where to look, or if he had stayed alive to sell them to you." "The significance of this escapes me," she said quietly. "You haven't anything to sell except perhaps your life." "I'd sell that cheap. For love or for a pair of dark glasses and a crack on the head from a high-heeled slipper." "Not to mention 3 slaps in the face," she said. "Goodbye, Mr. Marlowe. You came too late." "For me? Or for you?" She reached back and opened the door of the dressing room. "I think for both of us." She went in quickly, leaving the door open. "Come in and shut the door," her voice said from the dressing room. "Give me a cigarette." Her eyes came close to my face as I lit the cigarette for her. She reached up and pulled a fingertip down the side of my cheek. It burned like a hot iron. "How much money do you make, Marlowe?" $40 a day in expenses. That's the asking price. I'd take 25. I've taken less." I thought about Orpheme's worn 20. $25 a day, she said wonderingly. Little lonely dollars. Are they very lonely? Lonely as lighthouses. She crossed her legs, making no attempt to cover her thighs, and said, "So ask me the questions." "Who's Steelgrave?" "A man I've known for years, and liked. He owns things. A restaurant or 2. Where he comes from, that I don't know. Has he ever been in trouble with the police?" Her eyes widened a little too innocently. Her laugh was a little too silvery. "Don't be ridiculous. The man is worth $2 million. How'd he get it?" "How would I know?" "All right, you wouldn't. That cigarette's going to burn your fingers." I leaned across and took the stub out of her hand. Her hand lay open on her bare leg. I touched the palm with a fingertip. She drew away from me and tightened her hand into a fist. "Don't do that," she said sharply. "Why? I used to do that to girls when I was a kid." "I know." She was breathing a little fast. "It makes me feel very young and innocent and kind of naughty, and I'm far from being young and innocent anymore. I'm working for you. I wouldn't be if I thought you'd killed anybody. But you were there. You took a big chance. There was something you wanted very badly." She reached the photo out from somewhere and stared at it. It could hardly have been this. You and a man called Steelgrave in a booth at the dancers. Nothing in that. "Nothing at all," she said. So it has to be something about Steelgrave, or something about the date. Her eyes snapped down to the picture again. There's nothing to tell the date, she said quickly, unless the cut-out piece. Here. I gave her the cut-out piece. You're just building a sand castle, Marlowe. Really? I looked back at her, not grinning. You really think that? No, you don't. You went there. The man was murdered. You had a gun. He was a known crook, and I found something the police would love to have me hide from them, because it must be as full of motive as the ocean is full of salt. As long as the cops don't find it, I have a license, and as long as somebody else doesn't find it, I don't have an ice pick in the back of my neck. Would you say I was in an overpaid profession? She just sat there and looked at me, one hand on her kneecap, squeezing it. All I had to do was turn the knob and go out. I don't know why it had to be so hard to do. There was the usual coming and going in the corridor outside my office, and when I opened the door and walked in, the smell of old dust hung in the air as flat and stale as a football interview. I opened the windows and turned on the radio. It came up too loud, and when I had it turned down to normal, the phone sounded as if it had been ringing for some time. I took my hat off it and lifted the receiver. It was high time I heard from her again. Her cool, compact voice said, "This time, I really mean it. I lied before. I'm not lying now. I really have heard from Orrin." Wait a minute. I put the receiver down on the stained brown blotter and lit my pipe. No hurry. Lies are always patient. I took it up again. "This is very serious. He got my letter. He knew where I'd be staying and about when I'd be here, so he called up. He's staying with a doctor he got to know down there. I told you he had 2 years medical." "Doctor have a name?" "Yes, a funny name, Dr. Vincent Lagarde." "Just a minute. There's somebody at the door." I laid the phone down very carefully. I got a handkerchief out and wiped the palm of my hand and looked at my face in the flawed mirror. It was me, all right. I had a strange look. I'd been living too fast. "Dr. Vincent Lagarde, 965 Wyoming Street. Friend of the extinct Clausen. Maybe." I went back to the telephone and squeezed the jerks out of my voice. "What's Dr. Lagarde's phone number?" She gave it to me. It was right. I won't say the pieces were beginning to fall into place, but at least they were getting to look like parts of the same puzzle, which is all I ever get or ask. "Please go down there and help Orrin. Some gangsters are after him. They might kill him," she said quietly. "All right," I said. "All right. Please go at once. I have the address here. Just a moment." And the little bell rang, the one that rings far back at the end of the corridor and is not loud, but you'd better hear it. No matter what other noises there are, you'd better hear it. "He'll be in the phone book," I said. "Call me around 4. I hung up quickly. I took out the Luger and strapped it on. I drove to Dr. Lagarde's place. The sign over the door said, "Ring and enter." I rang, but the door wouldn't let me enter. I waited. I rang again. Then the door opened a crack very slowly, and a thin, expressionless face over a white uniform looked at me. "I'm sorry, the doctor is not seeing any patients." "I'm looking for a Mr. Quest. R&P Quest." "Who?" There was a dim reflection of shock behind her eyes, and she looked at me as if I had just come up from the floor of the ocean with a drowned mermaid under my arm. "I beg your pardon. Dr. Lagarde is not—" She was pushed out of the way by invisible hands, and a thin, dark, haunted man stood in the half-open doorway. "I am Dr. Lagarde. Who is it, please?" I gave him a card. He read it. "What was the name you mentioned?" Dr. Lagarde asked me softly. "Orrin Quest. His sister told me he was doing some kind of work for you, doctor." The nurse dabbed at her eyes furtively. The telephone on her desk burred and made her jump again. "Don't answer it," Dr. Lagarde said without turning his head. We waited while it rang. Everybody waits while a telephone rings. After a while it stopped. Why don't you go home, Miss Watson? There's nothing for you to do here. Thank you, Doctor, she said, and slipped away quietly. Dr. Lagarde turned back to me. Shall we go into my office? An open door showed a part of an examination room. The sterilizer was working in the corner. There were a lot of needles cooking in it. That's a lot of needles, I said, always quick with an idea. He looked at me levelly with his sorrowful eyes. I don't know anyone named Orrin Quest, Mr. Marlowe. I can't imagine any reason in the world why a person of that name should say he was in my house. Hiding out, I said. His eyebrows went up. From what? From some guys that might want to stick an ice pick in the back of his neck? On account of he's a little too quick with his little Leica, taking people's photographs when they want to be private. Or it could be something else like peddling reefers and he got wise. Am I talking in riddles? The doctor picked up a wicked-looking paper knife with a silver handle in the shape of a nude woman. He pricked the ball of his thumb. A pearl of dark blood showed on it. He put it to his mouth and licked it. I like the taste of blood, he said softly. I looked hard at him. It didn't buy me a way into his soul. He was quiet, dark, and shattered, and all the misery of life was in his eyes. But he was still gentle. Why don't you tell me about the needles, I said. I could be wrong, smelling that reefer smoke over at Clausen's place yesterday and having him call your number on the telephone and call you by your first name. All this has probably made me jump to wrong conclusions. I have dealt with addicts, he said. What doctor hasn't? We're a couple of sweethearts, I said. We just sit here making with the old over-the-desk dialogue, as though we hadn't a care in the world because both of us are going to be in the clink by nightfall. He raised his eyebrows again. I went on. You, because Clausen knew you by your first name, and you may have been the last man he talked to. Me, because I've been doing all the things a PI never gets away with. Hiding evidence, hiding information, finding bodies, and not coming in with my hat in my hand to these lovely, incorruptible Bay City cops. Oh, I'm through, very much through. But there's a wild perfume in the air this afternoon. I don't seem to care. Or I'm in love. I just don't seem to care. You've been drinking, he said slowly. Only Chanel No. 5 and kisses, and the pale glow of lovely legs, and the mocking invitation in deep blue eyes, innocent things like that. He just looked sadder than ever. Women can weaken a man terribly, can't they, he said. Clausen, a hopeless alcoholic. You probably know how they are. They drink and don't eat, and little by little the vitamin deficiency brings on symptoms of delirium. There's only one thing to do for them. Needles and more needles. It makes me feel dirty. I'm a graduate of the Sorbonne, but I practice among dirty little people in a dirty little town. Why? Because of something that happened years ago, in another city. Don't ask me too much, Mr. Marlowe. What was the rap, Doc? Narcotics, abortions? Or were you, by any chance, a medic for the gang boys in some hot eastern city? As for instance, he smiled thinly. As for instance, Cleveland. A very wild suggestion, my friend. His voice was like ice now. Wild as hell, I said, but a fellow like me with very limited brains tends to try to fit the things he knows into a pattern. It's often wrong, but it's an occupational disease with me. It goes like this, if you want to listen. I'm listening. He picked up the knife again. Clausen was killed very skillfully with an ice pick, killed while I was in the house upstairs talking to a grifter named Hicks. Hicks was also killed with an ice pick. His room had been searched. There was a woman there who had come to buy something from him. She didn't get it. I did get it. Presumption A. Clausen and Hicks killed by same man, not necessarily for same reason. Hicks killed because he muscled in on another guy's racket and muscled the other guy out. Clausen killed because he was a babbling drunk and might know who would be likely to kill Hicks. Any good so far? Not the slightest interest to me, Dr. Lagarde said. You are listening. Now what did I find? A photo of a movie queen and an ex-Cleveland gangster having lunch on a particular day. Day when this ex-Cleveland gangster was supposed to be in hock at the county jail. Also day when ex-Cleveland gangster's one-time sidekick was shot dead on Franklin Avenue in Los Angeles. Being in jail is a first-class alibi. Cops couldn't prove anything on ex-gangster. They turned him loose, but they wouldn't have turned him loose if they'd seen that photo. Photo, therefore, strong blackmail material. First against ex-Cleveland character, secondly against movie queen for being seen around with him in public. Presumption B, Orrin Quest, the boy I'm trying to find, took that photo, taken with contacts or Laco, without subjects knowing they were being photographed. Question, how did he get a chance to take photo? Answer, the movie queen was his sister. She would let him come up and speak to her. He was out of work, needed money. Likely enough, she gave him some and made it a condition he stay away from her. She wants no part of her family. The doctor stared at me moodily and said, "Why are you telling this rather dangerous story to me?" He reached a cigarette out of the box and tossed me one casually. I caught it and looked it over. Egyptian. Oval and fat, a little rich for my blood. I didn't light it. Just sat holding it between my fingers, watching his dark, unhappy eyes. "I'll tie you in on it now," I said. "You knew Clausen. You could have known some of his rumors. No proof either way. Presumption C. You knew Hicks, or Orrin Quest, or both. The L.A. cops couldn't or didn't establish identity of ex-Cleveland character. Let's give him his new name. Call him Steelgrave. But somebody had to be able to if that photo was worth killing people over. Did you ever practice medicine in Cleveland, Doctor?" "Certainly not." His voice seemed to come from far off. I said, "They have a whole room full of directories over at the telephone office from all over the country. I checked you out. A suite in a downtown office building, and now this, an almost furtive practice in a little beach town. You'd have liked to change your name, but you couldn't and keep your license. Somebody had to mastermind this deal, Doctor. Clausen was a bum, Hicks a stupid lout, Orrin Quest a nasty-minded creep, but they could be used. You couldn't go up against Steelgrave directly. You wouldn't have stayed alive long enough to brush your teeth. You had to work through pawns. Expendable pawns. Well, we getting anywhere?" He smiled faintly and almost whispered, "Presumption D, Mr. Marlowe. You are an unmitigated idiot." I grinned and reached for a match to light his fat Egyptian cigarette. "Added to all the rest," I said, "Orrin's sister calls me up and tells me he's in your house. These are a lot of weak arguments taken one at a time, I admit, but they do seem to sort of focus on you." I puffed peacefully on the cigarette. His face seemed to fluctuate and become vague, to move far off and come back. I felt a tightness in my chest. My mind had been slowed to a turtle's gallop. "Been dumb, haven't I?" said, with the cigarette still in my mouth and me still smoking it. Dumb was hardly the word. I was out of the chair, and my feet were stuck in 2 barrels of cement. When I spoke, my voice seemed to come through cotton wool. I sat down on the floor. "A little potassium hydrocyanide," a voice said over the transatlantic telephone. "Not fatal, not even dangerous. Merely relaxing." I started to get up off the floor. "You ought to try it sometime, but have somebody nail the floor down first. This one looped the loop." I started clawing for something to hold on to. There was nothing but the carpet. I was on what formerly had been my hands and knees. No sensation proved it. A face swam towards me out of the darkness. I changed direction and started for the face. There was no face. It was getting dark rapidly. There was no wall, no desk, and there was no floor. There was nothing. I wasn't even there. A big gorilla had a big black paw over my face and was trying to push it through the back of my neck. I realized that he was trying to keep me from opening my eyes. I decided to open my eyes just the same. Others had done it, why not me? I lifted the enormous weight of my eyelids. I was looking at the ceiling, lying on my back on the floor, a position in which my calling has occasionally placed me. I rolled my head. The room was still Dr. Lagardy's consulting room. I got up on my haunches and braced myself on the floor and shook my head. I was as dizzy as a dervish. At that moment I was aware that steps were coming down the hall. I leaned against the wall wearily and listened. Slow, dragging steps with a long pause between each. They seemed very, very tired. That made two of us. Then another sound. It was close by on the outside of a closed door that led from the examination room to the hallway. A thin, feeble scratch, possibly a young kitten wanting to be let in. "Okay, Marlowe, you're an old animal lover. Go over and let the kitten in." I started. I took a deep breath and got hold of the doorknob and opened it. Just at the last moment it occurred to me to reach for a gun. It occurred to me, but that's as far as I got. I just twisted the knob and opened the door instead. He was braced to the door frame by 4 hooked fingers made of white wax. He had eyes 1/8 of an inch deep, pale, gray-blue, wide open. Our faces were inches apart. Blood bubbled from his mouth and ran down his chin. He had stopped breathing. The white fingers slid away from the door frame. The man's body started to wind up on the legs. They scissored. His torso turned in mid-air like a swimmer in a wave and jumped at me. In the same moment, his other arm, the one that had been out of sight, came up and over in a galvanic sweep that seemed not to have any possible living impetus behind it. It fell across my left shoulder, and I reached for him. A bee stung me behind the shoulder blades. Something thumped to the floor and rattled against the bottom of the wall. I went down with him. Something had happened to his face. It now had a vague inner amusement, an almost roguish lift at the corners of the mouth. All of which was very silly, because I knew damn well that R&P Quest had not been that kind of boy. In the distance, a siren wailed. I got to my feet. A thing with a round, white wooden handle lay against the baseboard. It was an ice pick, with a file-down blade not more than 3 inches long. I stepped over the dark red pool in the doorway and looked along the hall. The blood trail led me back and across to a room furnished like a den. A metallic glitter near the leg of the studio couch turned out to be a used shell from an automatic, .32 caliber. I put it in my pocket. I went back out and up the stairs. There were 2 bedrooms, both in use. One contained R. Quest's meager wardrobe. Under the shirts, I found a Leica. I left all these things as they were and went back downstairs into the room, hesitated over the phone in the front room and left without touching it. The fact that I was still walking around was a pretty good indication that the good Dr. Lagardy hadn't killed anybody. I went around the corner of the house and got into my car and left. I stopped in front of a drugstore. It was time for me to make one more of my anonymous phone calls. "Come pick up the body, fellas." I looked in through the plate glass front of the store. A girl with slanted cheaters was reading a magazine. She looked something like Orphan Quest. Something tightened up my throat. She had a right to know first, law or no law. I drove on. I stopped at my office door with the key in my hand. She might be in there already, waiting, with her eyes shining behind the slanted cheaters and the small, moist mouth willing to be kissed. I'd have to tell her a harder thing than she dreamed of, and then after a while she'd go and I would never see her again. I opened the door. Silence and emptiness. A folded piece of paper lay at my feet. "Please call me at the apartment house. Most urgent. I must see you." It was signed D. I dialed the number of the Chateau Bercy and asked for Miss Gonzalez. "Ah, amigo, I waited so long in your funny little office. Can you come over here and talk to me?" "Impossible. I'm waiting for a call." "Well, may I come there?" "Come ahead." I sat there and waited for the telephone to ring. Wonderful what Hollywood'll do to a nobody. It'll make a radiant glamour queen out of a drab little wench who ought to be ironing a truck driver's shirts, and by remote control it might even take a small-town prig like R. Quest and make an ice-pick murderer out of him in a matter of months, elevating his simple meanness into the classic sadism of the multiple killer. It took her a little over 10 minutes to get there. She was all in black, like the night before. "You always wear black?" I asked. "But yes, it's more exciting when I take my clothes off." Thanks for telling me. What's the urgent matter we have to talk about? Going to bed with you is not urgent. It can be done any day. You're in a nasty mood, but you cannot humiliate me. Sex is a net with which I catch fools. Some of these fools are useful and generous. Occasionally, one is dangerous. She paused thoughtfully. I said, if you're waiting for me to say something that lets on I know who a certain party is, okay, I know who he is. I suppose you know he was in jail for 10 days last February, she said. He was my boyfriend also. Strange as it may seem, I'm not a hell of a lot interested in your love life, Miss Gonzalez. I assume it covers a wide field, all the way from Stein to Steelgrave. Stein? She asked softly. Who's Stein? A Cleveland hotshot that got himself gunned in front of your apartment house last February. She didn't laugh. But Steelgrave was in jail, and even if he was not in jail, even if, for example, I happened to be friendly with a certain county jail physician at the time, and he told me in an intimate moment that he had given Steelgrave a pass to go to the dentist on the very day Stein was shot, even if this happened to be true, would it not be a very poor way to use the information by blackmailing Steelgrave? I hate to talk big, I said, but I'm not afraid of Steelgrave. But I am, amigo. A witness to a gang murder is not in a very safe position in this country. No, we will not blackmail Steelgrave, and we will not say anything about Mr. Stein, whom I may not have known. It's enough that Mavis Weld is a close friend of a known gangster and is seen in public with him. We'd have to prove he was a known gangster, I said. Can we not do that? How? She made a disappointed mouth. But I felt sure that was what you had been doing these last couple of days. Why? I have private reasons. You know, Mavis will get $75,000 a picture from now on. She started to climb, and nothing will stop her, except possibly a bad scandal. Then somebody ought to tell her who Steelgrave is, I said. Why don't you? And incidentally, suppose we did have all this proof. What's Steelgrave doing all the time we're putting the bite on Weld? Does he have to know? I hardly think she'd tell him, but that would not matter to us if we had our proof, and if she knew we had it. Her black gauntleted hand moved towards her black bag. She hadn't looked at the bag. I hadn't either. I stood up. I might happen to be under some obligation to Miss Weld. If that was so, don't you think it's about time you got the hell out of my office? She put her hands on the arms of her chair and started to get up. I scooped up the bag before she could change direction. Her eyes filled with glare. She made a spitting sound. I opened the bag and went through and found a white envelope that looked a little familiar. Out of it I shook the photo with the dancers. The two pieces fitted together and pasted on another piece of paper. Interesting, I said. If it's not a fake. Is that Steelgrave? Where'd you get this? From Mavis Weld's purse in a dressing room. Her voice was cold. Give it back to me, please. I'll give it back to Mavis Weld, and I hate to tell you this, Miss Gonzalez, but I'd never get anywhere as a blackmailer. I just don't have the engaging personality. Very well, she said, it's my mistake. I thought you were smart. I can see that you're just another dumb private eye. She turned and went out slowly. The way she did it hadn't been learned at any business college. The phone rang. I picked it up and answered it. It was Christy French. Marlowe, we'd like to see you down at headquarters. Right away. I hung up and the phone rang again. It was her voice, all right, but it had a tone I'd never heard before. I called you up because you told me to, she said, but you don't have to tell me anything. I went down there. I borrowed a car. I tried to go after you when you came out, but I don't know the streets down there at all. I lost you. So I went back. I thought you looked kind of funny when you came out of the house, so I called the police and told them I'd heard shots. They came and one of them got into the house through a window. After a while, they let me in, and they wouldn't let me go. I had to tell them all about it. I was afraid something had happened to Orrin. I had to tell them about you, too. That's okay, I said. I'd have told them myself as soon as I could get a chance to tell you. It's kind of awkward for you, isn't it, she went on. You left him lying there on the floor, dead. Well, I guess you'll have to tell the police your reasons. Not necessarily, I said. "Oh, yes, you will," the voice said, and there was a ring of pleasure in it I couldn't account for. "You certainly will. They'll make you. You left him lying on the floor dead. I don't care what they do to you. If they put you in prison, I think I'd like that." "Did you see what he had in his hand?" I asked. "He didn't have anything in his hand." "That's fine," I said. "Well, goodbye. I'm going down to headquarters now. They want to see me. Good luck if I don't see you again. I did my best for you. Perhaps if you'd given me a little more information in the beginning." She hung up while I was saying it. In the center of the room was a long yellow oak table. Its edges were unevenly grooved with cigarette burns. Behind it was a window with wire over the stippled glass. Also behind it, with a mess of papers spread out untidily in front of him, was Detective Lieutenant Fred Bifus. At the other end, Christy French sat in a tilted-back swivel chair with his feet on the corner of the desk. "Sit down there," Bifus said, pointing. "Now, if you're in the mood, you could start in at the beginning and give us all the stuff you left out yesterday. Don't try to sort it out, just let it flow natural." "You got a client to protect," French said, watching me. "Name's Orphan Quest." "Ask your questions," I said. "What happened down there on Idaho Street?" "I went there looking for a brother. He'd moved away. I looked at the register and saw another man had moved into Quest's room. I talked to this man. He told me nothing that helped." French reached around and picked a pencil off the desk and tapped it against his teeth. "Ever see this man again?" "Yeah, I told him who I was. When I went downstairs, the manager, Clausen, was dead, and somebody had torn a page out of the register, the page with Quest's name on it. I called the police." "But you didn't stick around." "No, I had no information about Clausen's death." "But you didn't stick around," French repeated. "We could break you for that." "Consider me broke," I said. "I never liked the business anyway." "So you came back to your office. What then?" "I reported to the client. Then a guy called me up and asked me over to the Van Nuys Hotel. He was the same guy I talked to down on Idaho Street, but with a different name. You could have told us that, couldn't you?" "If I had, I'd have had to tell you everything. That would have violated the conditions of my employment." French nodded and tapped his pencil. He said slowly, "A murder wipes out agreements like that. 2 murders ought to do a double, and 2 murders by the same method, treble. You don't look good, Marlowe. You don't look good at all." "I don't even look good to the client," I said, "after today." "What happened today?" "She told me your brother had called her up from this doctor's house, Dr. Lagarde. The brother was in danger. I was to hurry on down and take care of him. Dr. Lagarde denied knowing anything about Orphan Quest. Then he slipped me a doped cigarette, and when I came to, I was alone in the house. Then I wasn't. Orphan Quest, or what was left of him, was scratching at the door. He fell through it and died as I opened it. With his last ounce of strength, he tried to stick me with an ice pick." French just shrugged. I continued. "Among other things, Clausen was probably pushing reefers. I sniffed marijuana smoke in his apartment. A tough little guy was counting money in the kitchen when I got there. He would be the runner. But Clausen was liquored to a point where he wouldn't want to trust him anymore. They don't go for that in the organizations. The runner thought I was a dick. Those people wouldn't want Clausen picked up. He'd be too easy to milk. The minute they smelled dick around the house, Clausen would be missing." French said, "Suppose it was so. What's it got to do with this Orphan Quest?" "Anybody can smoke reefers," I said, "if you're dull, lonely, depressed, and out of a job. But when you smoke them, you get warped and calloused emotions. Suppose Quest tried to put the bite on somebody and threatened to go to the police. Quite possible all 3 murders are connected with the reefer gang." "That don't jibe with Quest having a file-down ice pick," Bifus said. I said they might be standard equipment around Lagarde's house. He used to practice in Cleveland. Downtown in a large way. He must have had his reasons for hiding out in Bay City. "Cleveland, huh?" French drawled and looked at a corner of the ceiling. "If you were guessing, what would you guess they were looking for in that room at the Van Nuys?" "A claim check for a suitcase full of weed." "Not bad," French said. "And still guessing, where would it have been?" I thought about that. When I talked to Hicks down at Bay City, he wasn't wearing his muff. A man doesn't around the house, but he was wearing it on the bed at the Van Nuys. Maybe he didn't put it on himself. French said, "So?" Wouldn't be a bad place to stash a claim check. French said, "You could pin it down with a piece of Scotch tape. Quite an idea." There was a silence. After the pause, French said slowly, "Don't think for a minute you're in the clear, Marlowe. Let's break this off for now. The next move is up to the DA. I stood up. "Will it be all right if I don't leave town?" They didn't bother to answer that one. "What you standing there for?" Bifus asked sharply. "You want us to give you a great big spitty kiss?" He frowned and reached a pencil off the desk. With a quick motion of his fingers, he snapped it in half and held the two halves out on his palm. "We're giving you that much break," he said thinly. "Go out and square things up." I went on out, parting the silence as if I was pushing my way through water. My office was empty again. No leggy brunettes, no little girls with slanted glasses, no neat dark men with gangsters' eyes. I put my papers away in the drawer, straightened the pen stand, got out a duster and wiped off the glass, and then the telephone. It wouldn't ring tonight. Nobody would call me again. Not now, not this time. Perhaps not ever. The telephone rang. "Amigo," her voice said. "There's trouble, bad trouble. She wants to see you. She likes you. She thinks you're an honest man." "Where?" I asked. "You'll come?" "I'd sit up with a sick parrot tonight. Where do I go?" "I will come for you." Then she hung up. Down at the drugstore lunch counter, I had time to inhale 2 cups of coffee and a melted cheese sandwich with 2 slivers of ersatz bacon embedded in it, like dead fish in the silt at the bottom of a drained pool. I was crazy. I liked it. It was a black Mercury convertible with a light top. I leaned in at the door. Dolores Gonzalez slid over towards me along the leather seat. "You drive, please, amigo. I do not really ever like to drive." I leaned in the door of the car. Why didn't she call me? She couldn't. She did not have the number, and she had very little time. "Where is this place?" she called from. "I do not know the name of the street, but I can find you the house. That's why I come." Then she asked softly, "Will you make love to me tonight?" "Just for half an hour," I said. "Let's leave the sex to one side. It's great stuff like chocolate sundaes, but there comes a time you'd rather cut your throat. I guess maybe I better cut mine." I went around the car and slid under the wheel and started the motor. "Did you bring a gun?" she asked. "No, what would I want a gun for?" The inside of my left arm pressed against the Luger in the shoulder harness. She started to slide along the seat towards me. "Keep to your own side of the car," I said. "I've got to drive this heap." She pulled away in a huff. "I think you are very nasty to get along with," she said. "Turn right at the Lost Canyon Road." At Lost Canyon, I swung right, skirting the big gates that led into Bel Air. The road began to twist and climb. The road got steeper and narrower. There were houses behind walls and masses of shrubbery, but you couldn't see anything. Then we came to a fork, and there was a police car with a red spotlight parked at it, and across the right side of the fork, 2 cars parked at right angles. A torch waved up and down. "What goes on?" I said. "Amigo, I have no idea at all." Her voice had a hushed, withdrawn sound. She might have been a little scared. A tall man, the one with the torch, came around the side of the car and poked the flash at me, then lowered it. "We're not using this road tonight," he said. "Going anywhere in particular?" I snapped a light onto the tall man. He wore expensive-looking horn-rimmed glasses and had glossy, wavy black hair with a polka-dot scarf knotted around his neck. He looked as Hollywood as hell. "We just want to go to a place," I said. "What place?" the tall man asked, coolly. I turned to Dolores. "What place?" "It's a white house on the hill high up," she said. "And what did you plan to do up there?" the tall man asked. "The man who lives there is my friend," she said tartly. He shone the flash in her face for a moment. "You look swell," he said, "but we don't like your friend. We don't like characters that try to run gambling joints in this kind of neighborhood." "I know nothing about a gambling joint," Dolores told him sharply. "Neither do the cops," the tall man said. "They don't even want to find out. Those monkeys in the prowl car, and a lot more like them down at the city hall, just sit on their hands when we ask for the law to be enforced." I unlatched the car door and swung it open. I walked over to the prowl car. The 2 cops in it were leaning back lazily. "How's to break up this roadblock and let the citizens through?" I asked him. No orders, buddy. We're just here to keep the peace. Anybody starts anything, we finish it. Well, suppose I have urgent business up there. He looked at me without any expression and yawned. I went back to the Mercury, got my wallet out, and handed the tall man a card. I'm on business, I said. Let me through, and perhaps you won't need this block tomorrow. He turned to a man with a shotgun standing next to him and said, What do you think? Chance it, just the two of them and both sober. A car motor started. One of the block cars backed around onto the shoulder. Is this the only way in and out of here? I asked Dolores. They think it is, amigo. There is another way, but it's a private road through an estate. We would have to go around by the valley side. We nearly didn't get through, I told her. This can't be very bad trouble anybody's in. I knew you would find a way, amigo. Something stinks, I said nastily, and it isn't wild lilac. We topped a rise, and the road ended suddenly in a wide black circle edged with whitewashed stone. I turned the car around a white oleander bush and was in the motor yard of a long, low white house with a tile roof and a 4-car garage. There was no sound from the house, no sign of life. Dolores moved in the corner. She was shivering. What's the matter? Get out, please, she said, as if her teeth chattered. I got out, and so did she. Then she leaned up against me hard, thigh to thigh and breast to breast. Her arms went around my neck. I'm being very foolish, she said softly. He'll kill me for this, just as he killed Stein. Kiss me. I kissed her. Her lips were hot and dry. Is he in there? Yes. Who else? Nobody else. Except Mavis. He will kill her, too. I pushed her away from me, but gently. She stepped back and lifted her right hand quickly. There was a gun in it now. What a friend I would make if I pulled this trigger, she went on slowly, in a soft, tired voice. With Stein it did not matter. I would have killed him myself gladly, that filth. To die is not much, to kill is not much, but to entice people to their deaths. She broke off with what might have been a sob. Amigo, I liked you for some strange reason. I should be far beyond such nonsense. Mavis took him away from me, but I did not want to kill her. The world is full of men who have enough money. He has killed 12 men with a smile for each one. I have known him for a very long time. I knew him in Cleveland. If I give you the gun, will you kill him for me? I'd kill him if I had to, I said, licking along my lips. She held out the gun to me. I took it. I just stood there holding it. Then she smiled and tossed her head and jumped into the car. She started the motor and slammed the door shut. Then the car backed violently with a harsh tearing of the tires in the asphalt paving. I broke the magazine from the gun. It had 7 shells in it, 2 less than a full load. I sniffed at the muzzle. It had been fired since it was cleaned, fired twice perhaps. It had a white bone grip, 32 caliber. Arent Quest had been shot twice. The 2 exploded shells I picked up on the floor of the room were 32 caliber. And yesterday afternoon in room 332 of the Hotel Van Nuys, a blonde girl with a towel in front of her face had pointed a 32 caliber automatic with a white bone grip at me. You can get too fancy about these things. You can also not get fancy enough. I walked on rubber heels across to the garage and tried to open one of the 2 wide doors. There were no handles, so it must have been operated by a switch. I played a tiny pencil flash on the frame, but no switch looked at me. I left that and prowled over to the trash barrels. Under the porch was a door. This was unlocked and gave on darkness and the smell of corded eucalyptus wood. I closed the door behind me and put the little flash on again. In the corner there was another staircase with a thing like a dumbwaiter beside it. It wasn't dumb enough to let me work it. I started up the steps. Inside was a hallway. The kitchen was big enough for a dancing class. An open arch led to a butler's pantry, tiled to the ceiling, a sink, a huge icebox set into the wall, a lot of electrical stuff for making drinks without trying. You pick your poison, Press a button and 4 days later you wake up on the rubbing table in a reconditioning parlor. At last I came to what should be the living room. It was curtained and quite dark, but it had the feel of great size. I edged back to the wall and felt around for a light switch. Okay, you have a light switch in a natural place at a natural height. This room hadn't. This was a different kind of house. They had odd ways of handling doors and lights. The gadget this time might be something fancy like having to sing A above high C, or stepping on a flat button under the carpet, or maybe you just spoke and said, "Let there be light." I was psychic that night. I was a fellow who wanted company in a dark place and was willing to pay a high price for it. The Luger under my arm and the .32 in my hand made meat tough. Two-gun Marlowe. The kid from Cyanide Gulch. I took the wrinkles out of my lip and said aloud, "Hello again. Anybody here needing a detective?" Nothing answered me, but an amber light began to grow high up behind the cornice that circumnavigated the huge room. A blonde in a pale cocoa fur coat stood leaning against the side of a grandfather's chair. "Hello again yourself," she said in a dead voice. "I still think you came too late." I walked towards her, a movement which was always a pleasure. Even then, even in that too-silent house. "I need a drink," she said after a thick pause, "or maybe I'll fall down." Her eyelids fluttered up and down. "Go ahead and faint," I said. "I'll catch you on the first bounce." She pressed her lips together, fighting hard to stay on her feet. "Why did I come too late?" I asked. "Too late for what?" "Too late to be shot. Dolores will be disappointed as hell," she said, her mouth edged with white. "No. She put you on the spot just as she did Stein. She may have started out to, but she changed her mind." She laughed. It was a silly, pooped-out little laugh, like a child trying to be supercilious at a playroom tea party. When she stopped, a spent sigh drifted along the silence, and she caved at the knees and fell straight forward into my arms. If it was an act, it worked perfectly. I might have had guns in all 9 pockets, and they would have been as much use to me as 9 little pink candles on a birthday cake. But nothing happened. No hard character peeked at me with automatics in their hand. I got my right hand under her knees and carried her over to a gold couch and spread her out on it. I straightened up and went along to the bar. I poured dark and pungent brandy into the wrong kind of glass and went back over the bar top, taking the bottle with me. "Can you hold a glass?" She could with a little help. She drank the brandy. "Where's Steelgrave?" I asked. She just looked at me. She held the empty glass out, and I took it and put it somewhere or other without taking my eyes off her, nor she hers off me. "He was here," she said at last. "May I have a cigarette?" "The old cigarette stall," I said. I got a couple out and put them in my mouth and lit them. I leaned across and tucked one between her ruby lips. She puffed loosely and blinked, then put her hand up to adjust the cigarette. After all these years, I can never put a cigarette in a girl's mouth where she wants it. "You're rather nice," she said, "and when I didn't do anything sensational, for the kind of guy you are." I stood that well, too. "But I don't really know what kind of guy you are, do I?" She laughed suddenly, and a tear came from nowhere and slid down her cheek. "You're stalling for time," I said. "So where's Steelgrave?" "You ought to be glad wherever he is. He had to kill you, or thought he had." "You wanted me here, didn't you? Were you that fond of him?" "I must have been," she said. "Once. It seems like about 1,000 years ago I met a nice, quiet little guy who knew how to behave in public and didn't shoot his charm around every bistro in town. Yes, I liked him. I liked him a lot." She put her hand up to her mouth and bit a knuckle. Then she put the same hand into the pocket of the fur coat and brought out a white-handled automatic, the brother of the one I had myself. "And in the end I liked him with this," she said. I went over and took it out of her hand. I sniffed the muscle. Yeah, that made 2 of them fired around. I dropped it into my pocket. I watched her for a minute, biting at the end of my lip. She watched me. Then I started prowling the room with my eyes. "Try that chair with the magnolias on it," she said. It was turned away from me. I went over there, walking softly. He leaned in the corner of the chair with his head tilted back. His eyes were half open, as such eyes usually are. The bullet had gone through the outside pocket of his double-breasted jacket. It had been fired by someone who knew where the heart was. I touched his cheek, and it was still warm. Everything I had done or not done, everything wrong and everything right, all wasted. I went back and sat down near her and squeezed my kneecaps. "What did you expect me to do?" she asked. "He killed my brother." "Your brother was no angel," I said. "Didn't you ever wonder why Steelgrave never tried to get hold of those photographs, no matter what he had to do to get them?" She didn't answer. "How long have you known the photographs existed?" I asked. "Weeks, nearly 2 months. I got one in the mail a couple of days after we had lunch together. After Stein was killed." "Did you think Steelgrave had killed Stein?" "No, why should I?" "Until tonight, that is." "What happened after you got the photo?" "My brother Orrin called me and said he'd lost his job and was broke. He wanted money. He didn't say anything about the photo. He didn't have to." "Then what? More prints of the photo?" "One every week. I showed them to him." She gestured towards the chintzy chair. He didn't like it. "I didn't tell him about Orrin." "He must have known. His kind find things out." "I suppose so." "But not where Orrin was hiding out," I said, "or he wouldn't have waited this long. He knew that sooner or later the blackmailer would have to show himself. That's what Steelgrave was waiting for. He didn't care anything about the photo itself, except for your sake." Her voice came to me with glacial calm. "He killed my brother. He told me so himself." The gangster showed through then, all right. Funny people you meet in Hollywood. "You were fond of him once," I said brutally. Red spots flared on her cheeks. "I'm all through being fond of people. I stopped being fond of him last night. He asked me about you, who you were, and so on. I told him that I would have to admit that I was at the Van Nuys Hotel when that man was lying dead. After a moment, I said, "You didn't know when you went to the Van Nuys that Steelgrave was Weepy Moyer." "No, I didn't know. But when he was in jail that time, I had to know there was something about him that he didn't care to have known. I knew he had been in some kind of racket, I guess, but not killing people." "It's going to cost a lot of money to fix this," I said. For the first time, she smiled. It was a very small smile, but it was a smile. "I don't have a lot of money," she said. "So that's out." "How about Blue? You're worth a lot to him." "I'm not worth a plugged nickel to anybody. Forget it, Marlowe. You mean well, but I know these people." "That puts it up to me," I said. "That would be why you sent for me." "Wonderful," she said. "You fix it, darling. For free." I went and sat beside her on the davenport. I took hold of her arm and pulled her hand out of the fur pocket and took hold of that. It was almost ice cold in spite of the fur. She turned her head and looked at me squarely. She shook her head a little. "Believe me, darling, I'm not worth it, even to sleep with." I turned the hand over and opened the fingers out. They were stiff and resisted. I opened them out one by one. I smoothed the palm of her hand. "Tell me why you have the gun with you." "The gun?" "Don't take time to think. Just tell me. Did you mean to kill him?" "Why not, darling? I thought I meant something to him. He fooled me. Nobody means anything to the Steelgraves of this world, and nobody means anything to the Mavis Wells of this world anymore." The point of her shoe moved back and forth on the carpeting. "We've had a nice chat, darling. Why not call the police and get it over with? The phone number's over there at the end of the bar." "Thanks. Do you remember Dolores's number?" "Why Dolores?" When I didn't answer, she told me. I dialed. A sultry voice answered. "Hello?" "This is Marlowe. Did you really mean to put me in a spot?" I could almost hear her breath catch. "Amigo, but I am glad to hear your voice," she said. "Did you or didn't you?" I don't know. I'm very sad to think that I might have. I like you very much." "Is he?" Long pause. Careful. "Is he there?" "Well, in a way. He is. And yet, he isn't." I really did hear her breath this time. "I want to ask you something. It's deadly important. Tell me the truth. Where did you get that thing you gave me tonight?" "Why, from him. He gave it to me." "Why?" "He asked me to keep it." "Why?" "He did not say, amigo." "Notice anything unusual about it? About what he gave you?" "Why, no, I did not." "Yes, you did. You noticed that it had been fired and that it smelled of burnt powder. You didn't like to keep it. You gave it back to him." There was a long silence. She said at last, "But of course. But why did he want me to have it? I mean, if that was what happened." "He didn't tell you why. He just tried to ditch a gun on you when you weren't having any, remember?" "That is something I have to tell?" "See." "Good night," I said. "One moment, you have not told me what happened." "I haven't even telephoned you." I hung up and turned. Mavis Weld was standing in the middle of the floor watching me. "You have your car here?" I asked. "Yes." "Get going." "You can't get away with it," she said softly. "I killed him." "If you want to know my motive," I said, "it has nothing to do with you. I owe it to the Johns. I haven't played clean cards in this game. They know, I know. I'm just giving them a chance to use the loud pedal." "As if anyone ever had to give them that," she said, and turned abruptly and walked away. She went on without turning. A car started and the motor faded off into the distance. I carried the glass over to the bar and rinsed it in a little sink and set it back on the shelf. I went back to Steelgrave. I took the gun Dolores had given me, wiped it off, and put his small, limp hand around the butt, held it there and let go. The gun thudded to the carpet. The position looked natural. That left me with 3 guns. The weapon in his holster I took out and put it on the bar shelf under the counter, wrapped in a towel. The Luger I didn't touch. The other white-handled automatic was left. I tried to decide about how far away from him it had been fired. I stood about 3 feet from him and fired 2 shots past him. I laid the small automatic down on the dust cover of one of the tables. I went to the telephone and dialed the number of the Los Angeles Police Department. I asked the police operator for Christy French. "This is Marlowe. Remember over at the Van Nuys yesterday you said a man could make a friend if he got you something on Weepy Moyer?" He didn't sound very interested. "What you got on him?" "I'm assuming it's the same guy. Steelgrave. I'm out at Stillwood Heights, in a big house where they were setting up for gambling and the local residents didn't like it." "Read about it. Steelgrave there?" "He's here. I'm here alone with him." "Put him on the phone," French said at last. "You're not bright tonight, Christy. Why would I call you?" "Yeah," he said. "Stupid of me." "What's the address there?" "I don't know, but it's up at the end of Tower Road in Stillwood Heights. I'll be waiting for you." The phone clicked and I hung up. I went back in and felt the gun I had just fired. It was cold enough, and Mr. Steelgrave was beginning to look as if he meant to stay dead. No siren, but the sound of a car coming up the hill at last. I went out to meet it, me and my beautiful dream. They came in as they should, big, tough, and quiet, their eyes flickering with watchfulness and cautious with disbelief. They went along the room without haste and stood in front of him looking down solemnly. French leaned down and took the gun that lay on the floor. Bifus took the other white-handled gun by sliding a pencil into the end of the barrel. He sniffed. "Oh, yeah, this baby's been working. How's yours, Christy?" "Fired," French said. He sniffed again. "But not recently." Down at Bay City in a house on Wyoming Street, I said. Their heads swung around to me in unison. Guessing? French asked slowly. Yeah. Let's stop guessing and get to the part you know. A girl I know called me this evening and said a client of mine was in danger up here, from him. This girl rode me up here. She left me in back of the house and went home. Somebody with a name? French asked. Dolores Gonzalez. She's in pictures. Oh, Bifus said and rolled his eyes. Who's your client? Same one? French asked. No, this is another party altogether. She have a name? Not yet. They stared at me with hard, bright faces. New rules, huh? He said softly. I said, there has to be some agreement about publicity. The DA ought to be willing. There's a dozen ways we can find out, kid, Bifus said. Why go into this routine that makes it tough for all of us? No publicity, I said, unless charges are actually filed. You can't get away with it, Marlowe. God damn it, I said. This man killed Orrin Quest. You take that gun downtown and check it against the bullets in Quest. Give me that much at least before you force me into an impossible position. I wouldn't give you the dirty end of a burnt match, French said. He stared at me with cold hate in his eyes. You here when he got it? No. Who was? I won't lie to you, I said, and I won't tell you anything I don't want to tell except on the terms I stated. I don't know who was here when he got it. French turned his head slowly and said to Bifus, Put the cuffs on him. Bifus hesitated, then he took a pair of steel handcuffs out of his left hip pocket and came over to me. Put your hands behind you, he said in an uncomfortable voice. I'm going to make a little speech, French said. You're not going to like it. It's like this with us, baby. We're coppers and everybody hates our guts. And as if we didn't have enough trouble, we have to have you. As if we didn't get pushed around enough by the guys in the corner offices, the city gang, even the mayor. We spend our lives turning over dirty underwear and sniffing rotten teeth. We come home so goddamn tired we can't eat or sleep or even read the lies the papers print about us. Nothing we do is right, not ever, not once. If we make a mistake, they put us back in uniform on Skid Row and we spend the nice, cool summer evenings picking drunks out of the gutter and being yelled at by whores. But all that ain't enough to make us entirely happy. We got to have you. We got to have sharpers with private licenses hiding information and stirring up dust for us to breathe in. We got to have you suppressing evidence and framing setups that wouldn't fool a sick baby. Some of what you say is true, I said. Not all. Any private eye wants to play ball with the police. Sometimes he doesn't trust the police, and with cause. Sometimes he just gets in a jam without meaning to and has to play his hand out, you know, the way it's dealt. He'd usually rather have a new deal. He'd like to keep on earning a living. Your license is dead, French said. You're a man-eater tonight, I said. You want to break me in half, but you want an excuse, and you want me to give it to you? That might help, he said between his teeth. His right hand was hanging loose at his side. He was clenching and unclenching the fingers without knowing it. Take it easy, Christy, Bifus said. Lay off. French didn't move. Bifus came over and stepped between us. French said, Get out of there, Fred. No. French doubled his fist and slugged him hard on the point of the jaw. Bifus stumbled back and knocked me out of the way. After a while, he straightened up with a grunt. He turned and looked at me. He grinned. It's a new kind of third degree, he said. The cops beat hell out of each other and the suspect cracks up from the agony of watching. Bifus got out a pack of cigarettes and shook one loose and held the pack out to French. French looked at the cigarette, looked at Bifus. 17 years of it, he said. Even my wife hates me. Was it you I hit, Fred? Bifus said, Nobody hit me, Christy, nobody that I can remember. French said, Take the cuffs off him and take him out to the car. He's under arrest. I stared at French. His eyes didn't seem to see me at all. I went out under the archway and out of the house. It was about 5:30 and the sky behind the screened window was getting light. The room was the same room I had been in the afternoon before. An old cigar butt clung to the extreme edge of a glass ashtray. The door opened and a uniformed man came in with a tray. I ate canned corned beef hash and drank hot but weak coffee. By that time it was full morning. At 8:15, Christy French came in and stood with his hat on the back of his head and dark smudges under his eyes. He took his hat off and rumpled his hair. He stared at me with hard, morose eyes. "The DA wants to see you at 9 o'clock, he said. "After that, I guess you can go home. That is, if he doesn't hang a pinch on you." "I'm sorry you had to sit up in that chair all night." "It's all right," I said. "I needed the exercise." "Got Lagarde?" "Nah, he's a doctor all right, though." His eyes moved to mine. "He practiced in Cleveland." I said I hated to be that tidy. Young Quest wants to put the bite on Steelgrave, so he just by pure accident runs into the one guy in Bay City that could prove who Steelgrave was. That's too tidy. "Aren't you forgetting something?" Fern said. "Somebody had to tell him who Steelgrave was. When that photo was taken, Mo Stein hadn't been squibbed off. So what good was the photo unless somebody knew who Steelgrave was?" "I guess Miss Weld knew," I said. "And Quest was her brother." "You're not making much sense, chum." He grinned a tired grin. "Would she help her brother put the bite on her boyfriend and on her too?" "I give up. Maybe the photo was a fluke. How about Steelgrave?" "That's out of my hands." He started to get up. "When a gangster gets his, how long does the investigation last?" "Just as long as it's front-page stuff," I said. "But there's a question of identity involved here." "No." I just stared at him. "How do you mean no?" "Just no. We're sure." He was on his feet now. Out of the corner of his mouth he said in a low voice, "Off the record, we were always sure." "Thanks," I said. "I'll keep it to myself. How about the guns?" He stared at the table, then said, "They both belonged to Steelgrave. What's more, he had a permit to carry a gun. One of them killed Quest. The same gun killed Stein." He waited for me to say something. Then he said, "Well, so long. Nothing personal, you know, but I hope the DA takes your hide off in long, thin strips." He turned and went out. After a while, an orange-haired secretary came in and said, "Mr. Endicott's in his office. Know the way?" "I worked there once. Not for him, though. I got fired." I went out of the room, walking softly. You go in through double swing doors. Inside the double doors there's a combination PBX and information desk at which sits one of those ageless women you see around municipal offices everywhere in the world. They're what human beings turn into when they trade life for existence and ambition for security. Beyond this desk there's a row of glassed-in cubicles stretching along one side of a very long room. At the back of the cubicles a door was lettered Sewell Endicott, District Attorney. I knocked and went on into a big, airy corner room. Sewell Endicott sat behind a flat, dark desk and watched me come. "You're Marlowe?" I didn't think he really needed an answer to that. "You've been caught suppressing evidence helpful to the solution of a murder. That's obstructing justice. You could go up for it." "Suppressing what evidence?" I asked. He picked a photo off his desk and frowned at it. I looked across at the other two people in the room. They sat in chairs side by side. One of them was Mavis Weld. She wore the dark glasses with the wide white bows. By her side sat a man in an angelic pale gray flannel suit with a carnation the size of a dahlia in his lapel. I knew him by pictures I had seen in the papers. Lee Farrell, one of the hottest troubleshooting lawyers in the country. Endicott turned with polite deference to Mavis Weld. "And how well did you know Steelgrave, Miss Weld?" "Intimately." "I can hardly believe—" She broke off and shrugged. "And you are prepared to take the stand and swear as to the time and place when this photograph was taken?" He turned the photograph over and showed it to her. Farrell said indifferently, "Just a moment. Is that the evidence Mr. Marlowe is supposed to have suppressed?" "I asked the questions," Endicott said sharply. Farrell smiled. "Well, in case the answer is yes, that photo isn't evidence of anything." Endicott said softly, "Will you answer my question, Miss Weld?" She said quietly and easily, No, Mr. Endicott. I couldn't swear when the picture was taken or where. I didn't know it was being taken. All you have to do is look at it, Endicott suggested. And all I know is what I get from looking at it, she told him. I grinned. Farrell looked at me with a twinkle. Endicott caught the grin out of the corner of his eye. Something you find amusing? He snapped at me. I've been up all night. My face keeps slipping, I said. Will you amplify that, Miss Weld? I've had a lot of photos taken of me, Mr. Endicott, in a lot of different places and with a lot of different people. I've had lunch and dinner at the dancers with Mr. Steelgrave and with various other men. I don't know what you want me to say. Endicott said shortly, somebody shot Steelgrave to death last night. It could have been a woman. It could even have been Miss Weld. Well, let's assume a proceeding, Farrell said, one in which that photo is part of your evidence, if you can get it in. But you can't get it in. You see, Miss Weld won't get it in for you. You'd have to connect it up with a witness who could swear as to when, how, and where it was taken. The only man who could connect it up for you is the man who took it. I understand he's dead. Endicott said, this photo is clear evidence of itself that at a certain time and place, Steelgrave was not in jail and therefore had no alibi for the killing of Stein. Farrell said, it's evidence when and if you get it introduced in evidence. Forget that picture. It proves nothing whatsoever. And if that's the evidence Marlowe suppressed, then he didn't in a legal sense suppress evidence at all. I wasn't thinking of trying Steelgrave for murder, Endicott said dryly, but I'm a little interested in who killed him. The police department, fantastically enough, also has an interest in that. I hope our interest doesn't offend you. Miss Weld, this office, or the present incumbent of it at least, doesn't believe in seeking publicity at the expense of people to whom a certain kind of publicity might be fatal. I don't think you've been quite candid with me about this photograph, but I won't press the matter now. There's not much point in my asking you whether you shot Steelgrave, but I do ask you whether you have any knowledge that would point to who may have or might have killed him. She faced Endicott squarely. No. He stood up and bowed. That'll be all for now, then. Thanks for coming in. They went out. She didn't seem to look at me when she went out, but something touched the back of my neck lightly. Probably accidental. Her sleeve. Endicott watched the door close. Is Farrell representing you? I forgot to ask him. I can't afford him, so I'm vulnerable. He smiled thinly. I let them take all the tricks and then solve my dignity by working out on you, huh? I couldn't stop you. Don't you think you owe a certain obligation to the law, Mr. Marlowe? I would, if the law was like you. We think of the law as an enemy. We're a nation of cop-haters. It'll take a lot to change that, I said, on both sides. Yes, he said quietly, it will. But somebody has to make a beginning. Thanks for coming in. As I went out, the secretary came in another door with a fat file in her hand. A shave and a second breakfast made me feel a little less like the box of shavings the cat had had kittens in. I went up to the office and unlocked the door, and sniffed in the twice-breathed air and the smell of dust. I reached down and put the bottle of Old Forester up on the desk. Old Forester. Now who gave you that, pal? That's green label stuff, out of your class entirely. Must have been a client. I had a client once. And that got me thinking about her. And maybe I have stronger thoughts than I know. The telephone rang, and the funny little precise voice sounded just as it had the first time she called me up. She said, "If you're alone, I'm coming up." "Uh-huh." "I suppose you're mad at me," she said, "but I'm coming up anyway." She hung up. Then I heard her tripping along the hall. "It's me," she said. "I'm going home." She put her bag on the desk and drew a line along the desk with her fingertip. "I can't remember whether I gave you back your $20 or not," I said. "Oh, you gave it to me," she said. "Thank you." I picked up a pencil and felt the point. I reached across and slipped the pencil through the strap of her bag and pulled it towards me. "Don't touch my bag," she said quickly, and reached for it. I grinned and drew it out of her reach. "All right." But it's such a cute little bag. It's so like you." She leaned back. There was a vague worry behind her eyes, but she smiled. "You think I'm cute, Philip? I'm so ordinary." "I wouldn't say so." "You wouldn't?" "Hell no. I think you're one of the most unusual girls I ever met." I swung the bag by its strap and set it down on the corner of the desk. Her eyes fastened on it quickly, but she licked her lip and kept on smiling at me. She looked down at the desk. "I wish you'd tell me," she said slowly, "what happened to Orrin. I'm all confused." "I told you he probably went off the rails the first time you came in, remember? I don't want to go psychological on you, but I figure he was just the type to go very completely haywire if he went haywire at all. Then there's that awful money hunger that runs in your family. All except one." She smiled at me now. If she thought I meant her, that was Jake with me. "There's one question I want to ask you," I said. "Was your father married before?" She nodded yes. "That helps. Lila had another mother. That suits me fine." There was a tidy little silence while she looked at her bag again. I was beginning to get curious about that bag. "How did Orrin find out something about Steelgrave that the cops didn't know?" "I don't know," she said slowly, picking her way among her words like a cat on a fence. "Could it have been that doctor?" "Oh, sure," I said with a big warm smile. "He and Orrin got to be friends somehow, a common interest in sharp tools, maybe." "Now you're just being nasty," she said. "Every so often you have to be that way." "Such a pity," I said. "I'd be a lovable character if I'd let myself alone." "Nice bag." I reached for it and pulled it in front of me and snapped it open. She came out of her chair and lunged. "You let my bag alone!" I looked her straight in the rimless glasses. "You want to go home to Manhattan, Kansas, don't you? Today? You got your ticket and everything?" She worked her lips and slowly sat down. "Okay," I said. "I'm not stopping you. I just wondered how much dough you squeezed out of the deal." She began to cry. I opened the bag and went through it. Nothing until I came to the zipper pocket at the back. I unzipped it and reached in. There was a flat packet of new bills in there. I took them out and riffled them. 10 centuries. All new, all nice. An even $1,000. "Lila gave the money to me," she said softly. "What size chisel did you use?" A tear ran down her cheek. "Skip it," I said. I dropped the pack of money back into the bag, snapped the bag shut, and pushed it across the desk to her. "I guess you and Orrin belong to that same class of people that can convince themselves that everything they do is right. He can blackmail his sister, and then when a couple of small-time crooks get wise to his racket and take it away from him, he can sneak up on them and knock them off with an ice pick in the back of the neck. Probably didn't even keep him awake that night. You can do much the same. Lila didn't give you that money. Steelgrave gave it to you. For what?" "You're filthy," she said. "You're vile." "Who tipped off the law that Dr. Lagarde knew Clausen? I didn't. So you did. To smoke out your brother who was not cutting you in. What did you hire me for?" "I didn't know," she said evenly. "Orrin never mentioned any names. I didn't even know Orrin had lost his pictures, but I knew he'd taken them and that they were very valuable. I came out to make sure Orrin treated me right. He could be awfully mean at times. He might have kept all that money himself." "Why did he call you up night before last?" "He was scared. Dr. Lagarde wasn't pleased with him anymore. He didn't have the pictures. Somebody else had them. Orrin didn't know who, but he was scared. I had them. I still have," I said. "I don't believe you," she said. I got up and went to the safe. In a moment I was back with the envelope. I poured the prints and the negatives out on the desk, my side of the desk. She looked down at them and started to reach. I picked them up. "What did you sell Steelgrave for the $1,000?" Her mouth fell open and she looked ugly. "You had one thing to sell," I said. "You knew where Orrin was. To Steelgrave that information was worth $1,000. Easy. Steelgrave went down there and killed him. He paid you the money for the address." "Lila told him," she said in a faraway voice. Lila told me, she told him, I said. If necessary, Lila would tell the world, she told him. Just as she would tell the world she killed Steelgrave, if that was the only way out. Lila's a sort of free and easy Hollywood babe that doesn't have very good morals, but when it comes to bedrock guts, she has what it takes. She's not the ice pick type, and she's not the blood money type. Your own brother. $1,000 blood money. I hope you'll be happy with it. She stood away from the chair and took a couple of steps backward. Then suddenly she giggled. Who can prove it? She half squealed. Who's alive to prove it? I was still holding the packet of photos. I struck a match and dropped the negative into the ashtray and watched it flare up. She stopped dead, frozen in a kind of horror. I started to tear the pictures into strips. I grinned at her. I could tell the police, she whispered. I could tell them a lot of things. They'd believe me. I could tell them who shot Steelgrave, I said, because I know who didn't. They might believe me. The small head jerked up. The light glinted on the glasses. There were no eyes behind them. Don't worry, I said. I'm not going to. It wouldn't cost me enough, and it would cost somebody else too much. The telephone rang, and she jumped a foot. I turned and reached for it and said hello. Amigo, are you all right? There was a sound in the background. I swung around and saw the door click shut. I was alone in the room. I'm tired, I said. Has the little one called you up? The little sister? She was just in here. She's on her way back to Manhattan with the swag. The swag? The pocket money she got from Steelgrave for fingering her brother. There was a silence, then she said gravely, You cannot know that, amigo. Like I know I'm sitting leaning on this desk, like I know I hear your voice, and not quite so certainly, but certainly enough like I know who shot Steelgrave. You are somewhat foolish to say that to me, amigo. I am not above reproach. You should not trust me too much. I make mistakes, but this won't be one. I've burned all the photographs. She tinkled her laugh over the wire. Would you like to take me to lunch? I'll come over in a little while, I said, and hung up. The Chateau Bercy was old but made over. It had a general air of having been redecorated by a parolee from a nuthatch. I rang a bell, and a large, soft man oozed out from behind a wall and smiled at me. Miss Gonzales, I said. Name's Marlowe. She's expecting me. Yes, Mr. Marlowe. Miss Gonzales says to come right up. There was a small bell push beside apartment 412. It chimed softly inside. The door was swung open instantly. The beautiful dark eyes looked at me and the red mouth smiled at me. Amigo, she said softly. She put her arms out. I took hold of her wrists and brought them together and made her palms touch. I played patty cake with her for a moment. I let go of her wrists, closed the door with my elbow, and slid past her. I didn't look at her. I didn't want to. 4 hours sleep and a couple of drinks, I said, and I'd be able to talk nonsense to you again. Right now I've barely strength to talk sense, but I've got to. She looked at me with grave dark eyes. But yes, amigo, whatever you wish. Where did you live in Cleveland? In Cleveland? You said you knew him there. She thought back and then nodded. I was married then, amigo. What is the matter? You got to know Steelgrave. How? It was just that in those days it was fun to know a gangster. A form of inverted snobbery, I suppose. You let him pick you up. She nodded brightly. Let us say I picked him up. What about your husband? She smiled. The streets of the world are paved with discarded husbands, she said. Ain't it the truth? You find them everywhere, even in Bay City. That bought me nothing. Might even be a graduate of the Sorbonne. Might even be mooning away in a measly small-town practice, waiting and hoping. The polite smile stayed in place on her lovely face. Amigo, I said. What? You don't use much Spanish, do you? Amigo gets worn to shreds. The only thing Mexican about you is a few words and a careful way of talking. I'm in bad trouble downtown, I went on. Apparently Miss Weld had the good sense to tell it to her boss, and he came through, got Lee Farrell for her. I don't think they think she shot Steelgrave, but they think I know who did, and they don't love me anymore. And do you know, amigo? Told you over the phone I did. She looked at me steadily for a longish moment. I was there. It was very curious, really. The little girl wanted to see the gambling house. She'd never seen anything like that. I called him up and he said to come along. When we got there, he was drunk. I'd never seen him drunk before. He laughed and put his arm around little Orpha and told her she had earned her money well. He said he had something for her. Then he took from his pocket a billfold wrapped in a cloth. When she unwrapped it, there was a hole in the middle of it, and the hole was stained with blood. That wasn't nice, I said. I wouldn't even call it characteristic. You don't know him very well. Little Orpha took the billfold and stared at it, and then she thanked him and opened her bag to put the billfold in it. But instead she took a gun out of her bag. It was a gun he had given to Mavis, I think. She turned around and shot him dead with one shot. It was very dramatic. You made her confess to Mavis Weld, I said. She nodded. It wasn't you gave Orpha the $1,000, was it, darling, to make her tell? I don't care to answer that, she said with dignity. No. So last night when you rushed me out here, you already knew Steelgrave was dead, and there wasn't anything to be afraid of, and that act with the gun was just an act. She said softly, there was a situation, and I knew that somehow or other you would get Mavis out of it. There was no one else who could. Mavis was determined to take the blame. I chased her out, I said. Mavis I'm talking about. She had the gun, the twin of the one you gave me. You didn't probably notice that yours had been fired. I know very little about guns, she said softly. Sure. Quest was killed with 2 shots from a .32 automatic, same caliber. I picked up the empty shells in the den down there. Down where, amigo? It was beginning to grate. Too much, amigo. Far too much. Of course I couldn't know it was the same gun, but it seemed worth trying out. Only confuse things up a little anyhow, and give Mavis that much break. So I switched guns on him and put his behind the bar. His was a black .38, more like what he would carry if he carried one at all. Even with a checked grip you can leave prints, but with an ivory grip you're apt to leave a fair set of finger marks on the left side. Steelgrave wouldn't carry that kind of gun. Her eyes were round and empty and puzzled. I'm afraid I'm not following you too well. And if he killed a man, he would kill him dead, and be sure about it. This guy got up and walked a bit. A flash of something showed in her eyes and was gone. She smiled. You were present when little Orpha told him where to go. Oh, yes, of course. Nice recovery, fast and clean, but her smile looked a little more tired. Only he didn't go, I said. Her cigarette stopped in midair, that was all. Nothing else. That's what's been the matter all along, I said. Steelgrave is a reformed character and doing fine. Then this Stein comes out bothering him, wanting to cut in. Okay, Stein has to go. Steelgrave doesn't want to kill anybody, and he's never been accused of killing anybody, but he has to get rid of Stein, so he gets himself pinched. And then he gets out of jail by bribing the jail doctor, and he kills Stein and goes back into jail at once. I looked her over for cracks, but there weren't any, yet. So far so good, but we've got to give this lad credit for a few brains. Why did he let them hold him in jail for 10 days? Answer 1, to make himself an alibi. Answer 2, because he knew that sooner or later this question of him being Moyer was going to get aired, so why not give them time and get it over with? That way, any time a racket boy gets blown down around here, they're not going to keep pulling Steelgrave in and trying to hang the rap on him. You like the idea, amigo? Yeah. Look at it this way. Why would he have lunch in a public place the very day he was out of the cooler to knock Stein off? And if he did, why would young Quest happen around to snap that picture? Stein hadn't been killed, so the picture wasn't evidence of anything. I like people to be lucky, but that's too lucky. Again, even if Steelgrave didn't know his picture had been taken, he knew who Quest was. Must have. Quest had been tapping his sister for eating money since he lost his job, maybe before. Steelgrave had a key to her apartment. He must have known something about this brother of hers, which simply adds up to the result that that night of all nights, Steelgrave would not have shot Stein, even if he had planned to. "It is now for me to ask you who did," she said politely. Somebody who knew Stein and could get close to him. Somebody who already knew that photo had been taken, knew that Mavis Weld was on the edge of becoming a big star, knew that her association with Steelgrave was dangerous, but would be 1,000 times more dangerous if Steelgrave could be framed for the murder of Stein. Knew Quest because he had been to Mavis Weld's apartment and had met him there and given him the works, and he was a boy that could be knocked clean out of his mind by that sort of treatment. Knew that those bone-handled .32s were registered to Steelgrave, although he'd only bought them to give to a couple of girls, and if he carried a gun himself, it would be one that was not registered and could not be traced to him. Knew— "Stop!" Her voice was a sharp stab of sound. "You will stop at once, please." She leaned back and a pulse beat in her throat. She was exquisite. She was dark. She was deadly. And nothing would ever touch her, not even the law. "Why did you kill Quest?" I asked her. She stood up and came close to me, smiling again. "For 2 reasons, amigo. He was more than a little crazy, and in the end he would have killed me. And the other reason is that none of this, absolutely none of it, was for money. It was for love." I started to laugh in her face. I didn't. She was dead serious. It was out of this world. "No matter how many lovers a woman may have," she said softly, "there is always one she cannot bear to lose to another woman. He was the one." I just stared into her lovely dark eyes. "I believe you," I said at last. "The man I loved is dead. I killed him. That man I would not share." She smiled a free, beautiful, and perfectly natural smile. "And you cannot do a damn thing about all this, darling, unless you destroy Mavis Weld utterly and finally." I moved towards the door without putting my back to her. I didn't really expect a slug. I thought she liked better having me the way I was, and not being able to do a damn thing about any of it. I looked back as I opened the door, slim, dark, and lovely, and smiling, reeking with sex, utterly beyond the moral laws of this or any world I could imagine. I went out quietly. As the elevator opened at the lobby, a man stood there waiting for it. He kept his chin low. "Dr. Lagarde," I said softly. He glanced at me with no trace of recognition. He moved into the elevator. I went across to the desk and banged the bell. "Give me the phone." I dialed Madison 7911. The voice said, "Please." "Chateau Bercy Apartments. A man named Dr. Vincent Lagarde, wanted for questioning by homicide Lieutenants French and Bifus, has just gone up to apartment 412. This is Philip Marlowe, a private detective. Wait there, please, and hold him if he tries to leave." They came fast, but not fast enough. Perhaps I ought to have stopped him. Perhaps I had a hunch what he would do and deliberately let him do it. Sometimes when I'm low, I try to reason it out, but it gets too complicated. The whole damn case was that way. There was never a point where I could do the natural, obvious thing without stopping to rack my head dizzy with figuring how it would affect somebody I owed something to. When they cracked the door, he was sitting on the couch, holding her pressed against his heart. His eyes were blind, and there was bloody foam on his lips. He had bitten through his tongue. Under her left breast lay the silver handle of a knife I had seen before. The handle was in the shape of a naked woman. The eyes of Miss Dolores Gonzalez were half open, and on her lips there was the dim ghost of a provocative smile. "The Hippocrates smile," the ambulance interne said, and sighed. "On her it looks good." He glanced across at Dr. Lagarde, who saw nothing and heard nothing if you could judge by his face. "I guess somebody lost a dream," the interne said. He bent over and closed her eyes. Copyright 1987, Dove Books on Tape, Incorporated.